Chapter 13. War as a Rape of the Soul. What greater pain could mortals have than this, to see their children dead before their eyes? Euripides. When many people are being killed, they should be mourned in heartfelt sorrow. That is why a victory must be observed like a funeral. Tao Te Ching, translated by Jia Fu Feng and Jane English. The divine and the demonic are very close together. Only a thin line separates them. We who are indeed capable of divinity are also capable of the demonic, and the deepest of all demonic activity is the use of our divine imaginations to invent destruction. Matthew Fox, Original Blessing. This thing of darkness I acknowledge mine. Prospero in The Tempest.
The destruction of the life of another human being, and, in a wider sense, the life of the planet and the species it sustains, becomes easier to accept when the sense of the sacred is lost, when people no longer feel they are living within a sacred order, and when the values of the real world prevail over the values of another order of reality, values which religions have tried and failed to establish. What is the effect of war on the soul? From the perspective of the cosmic dimension of soul and the different values related to humanity's responsibility towards the earth described in Chapter 10, war dehumanizes us and corrupts us in our very soul. It is a crime against the sacred order of life. War inflicts a terrible wound on the soul, a wound that can never heal because of the legacy of the traumas and memories it leaves behind, not only with the living, but with the dead. At the beginning of her book, A Small Corner of Hell, Dispatches from Chechnya, Anna Politkovskaya, the Russian journalist assassinated outside her home in Moscow in 2006, for speaking out against the atrocities she witnessed in Chechnya, quotes a passage from an early book written by Tolstoy. I have included it in this chapter in memory of her courage in exposing the horrors of war, and also in memory of Tolstoy and his hatred of war.
All nature seemed filled with peace-giving power and beauty. Is there not room enough for men to live in peace in this magnificent world, under this infinite starry sky? How is it that wrath, vengeance, or the lust to kill their fellow men can persist in the soul of man in the midst of this entrancing nature? Everything evil in the heart of man ought, one would think, to vanish in contact with nature, in which beauty and goodness find their most direct expression. War. What an incomprehensible phenomenon! When reason asks itself, is it just? Is it necessary? An internal voice always answers no. Only the permanence of this unnatural phenomenon makes it natural, and only the instinct for self-preservation makes it just. Chapter 6 described how, during the 4,000 years of the solar era, war became endemic until, in the last century, the most demonic weapon ever devised by man was used against civilians in the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The philosopher John Gray accurately observes in his book Straw Dogs that, as science and technology have advanced, so has proficiency in killing. As the hope for a better world has grown, so has mass murder. In July 1955, Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, Joseph Rotblat, who left the Manhattan Project when he saw where it was leading, and 8 others signed a manifesto warning of the dire consequences of nuclear war, urging complete global disarmament. This statement, known as the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, was Einstein's final public act, and he died shortly after signing it. In it, The signatories urge people to remember their humanity and forget the rest. We have to learn to think in a new way. We have to learn to ask ourselves not what steps can be taken to give military victory to whatever group we prefer, for there no longer are such steps. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what steps can be taken to prevent a military contest of which the issue must be disastrous to all parties? War encourages and justifies the propensity for cruelty latent in each one of us. It desensitizes those of us who are in a position to kill others and unleashes our innate capacity for barbarism. To begin with, we may hesitate to kill others, restrained by an instinctive empathy, but the ability to kill soon develops into pride, even the enjoyment of the skill of killing and the ability, whether as nations or individuals, to commit unspeakable crimes. The very first result of the bombing of Hiroshima was to encourage other states to develop the same weapon so they would be on an equal footing with the power of the nuclear state. Proliferation has led to further proliferation in a kind of escalating sibling rivalry. Now Iran is developing a nuclear bomb, drawing the inevitable defensive response from Israel and the West. It is not difficult to see that these agents of mass death do not protect us from war, but inexorably draw us toward their ultimate use. Relinquishing these weapons is the most challenging task for our species to accomplish, because it goes against all our conditioning and our deepest survival instincts. In addition to these, it goes against an immensely powerful solar mythology that holds us in a kind of collective spell, convincing us that we have continually to prepare for war, and that once embarked on war, we must achieve victory. The Solar Era and the Warrior Ethos. During the 4,000 years of the Solar Era, war has been a constant presence, glorified as the noblest activity for man. Victory and the spoils of war were coveted treasure to be won in battle, courage in the face of death, the supreme virtue. America and the Christian West, as well as the State of Israel and the entire Muslim world, are still under the polarizing spell of solar mythology, which dramatizes the battle between good and evil, the forcible conversion and defeat of others by the sword, the bomb, and now the unmanned, remotely guided missile is more than a memory. It is an ever-present reality. War has for centuries consistently been encouraged, defended, and promoted by patriarchal cultures. The Old Testament proclaims a warlike God, determined to vanquish his enemies. Christianity and Islam have both been warrior civilizations. If there is one book which illustrates the pattern of war embedded in all three patriarchal cultures, it is the blood-soaked history of Jerusalem, brilliantly explored by Simon Sebag Montefiore in Jerusalem, the Biography, 2011. Yet now this ancient warrior ethos that is so deeply imprinted on the male psyche is being called into question as many individuals realize that because of their devastating effect on the fabric of civilization, let alone the planet, the sacrificial rituals of war can no longer be an option for us. Law and order have come into being to restrain the dangerous propensities of our nature within civilized society. War demolishes that restraint and gives us permission to justify acts of the utmost barbarity as long as they are inflicted on an enemy. War invites the release of a colossal amount of instinctive energy that may have no outlet in the more contained precinct of everyday life. It may develop skills that people did not know they had, give them access to emotions they have never experienced. With survival instincts on highest alert, war makes people feel intensely alive, released to act in savage ways that are unacceptable in a situation where peace and order prevail. War draws men together in a deep, lasting bond of brotherhood, and a nation together in a shared will to protect itself against a perceived threat. War arouses, excites, ennobles, fascinates, but it also degrades and corrupts. Like sleepwalkers under the spell of solar myth and the archetypal battle of good against evil, we enter into it, unaware that we are held in thrall to a pattern of behavior that has the power to ensnare us in its web. Yet, one positive sign today is that people are becoming disillusioned with the rhetoric of war and resistant to their government's efforts to engage in it. Government justification of war sounds increasingly hollow in the light of the horrific weapons we have developed, the colossal expense of war, the heavy civilian casualties, the anguish of bereaved parents, and the injuries, both physical and mental, that the survivors of combat will carry for the rest of their lives. War can never be anything other than a tragedy, as the Chinese Taoist sages perceived so long ago. No one doubts the heroism of the young soldier who sacrifices his or her life for their country. What is increasingly doubted is the wisdom of political leaders who call for that sacrifice when the situation does not justify it, who dispense with the precious lives of young men and women and those of helpless civilians as if they were crumbs to be swept from a table. The presentation of war as a necessity is increasingly being challenged by people who believe that war sows the seeds of further conflict and encourages the potential use of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, not necessarily by a nation, but by a deranged individual who has gained access to one of these weapons or the means of manufacturing one and will not hesitate to use it. As a species, we are responsible for bringing these weapons into being, and, as a species, we can choose to put an end to them, because their very existence pollutes the earth. Generation after generation, people have accepted the call to sacrifice their sons in war, and have endured the immense suffering caused by war as an inescapable fact of life. Imagining God to be all-powerful and on the side of the good, they have asked God to intervene to protect them and bring them victory to stand by their side. Yet it is we who carry within our nature the godlike capacity for creation and destruction, for bringing good and evil into the world. The burden of responsibility to change our fate therefore lies with us, not with God. With the help of the psychological insight gained over the last 100 years, we can now address the fundamental causes of human aggression and understand why certain patterns of behavior are reenacted over and over again, even before our eyes today. Weapons, defense, and war have traditionally been and still are the concern of men. Women have not, until the end of the last century, participated as combatants in war. They have suffered unspeakably, have lost their own lives and the lives of husbands, fathers, and sons in war, and have had to endure the largely undocumented rape of themselves and their daughters. But in the past their voice has been inaudible. Yet war is as much woman's concern as man's. If the destructive power of our weapons continues to escalate, then, with the power of these weapons and our moral immaturity, we risk destroying not only civilization and our own species, but much viable life on this planet. Today, women are adding their voices to those of men who can see that war leads nowhere, and who are appalled by the irresponsible behavior of leaders who take their countries into it, leaders whose immaturity and ignorance of the deeper archetypal and mythic issues involved may render them ill-equipped to assume such awesome responsibility. In his Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn warns us to bear in mind our own contribution to evil, commenting that it is not so easy to separate evil from ourselves and blame it on our enemy. If only it were all so simple, he writes. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? The ongoing addiction to war. The unconscious addiction to war remains an ever-present threat, summarized in the words of Colin Gray, Professor of International Politics and Strategic Studies at the University of Reading, in Another Bloody Century. He takes it for granted that there will be war in the future for the simple reason that there has been war in the past. War and warfare will always be with us. War is a permanent feature of the human condition. Efforts to control, limit, and regulate war, and therefore warfare, by international, political, legal, and normative ethical measures and attitudes are well worth pursuing. However, the benefits from such endeavors will always be fragile, vulnerable to overturn by the commands of perceived belligerent necessity. The idea that war is part of the natural order of life is open to question, since there is little evidence for the existence of warrior cultures prior to the rise of the powerful city-states in the Middle East circa 3500 BC. There is, for example, no evidence of war and weapons in the civilization of Old Europe, 7500 to 3500 BC, nor in the extraordinary settlement of Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, Turkey, during the same period. There is evidence, although not in these two cultures, of human sacrifice, but not the massive collective sacrifice of war. The survival instinct is certainly one of the factors in the history of war, but the warrior ethos is something that was highly developed during the solar era and has become a habit, an addiction. What needs to be challenged is the deeply ingrained belief in the inevitability, necessity, and benefits of war, reflected in the words of the German Field Marshal Helmut Graf von Moltke, who, in 1880, wrote, "Eternal peace is a dream, and not even a pleasant one. War is a part of God's world order. War develops man's noblest virtues, which otherwise would slumber and die out: courage, self-denial, devotion to duty, and willingness to make sacrifices. A man never forgets his experiences in war. They increase his capability for all time to come." His words were echoed 100 years later, on the anniversary of the Prophet Muhammad's birthday, by the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1983. War is a blessing for the world and for all nations. It is God who incites men to fight and to kill. The wars the Prophet led against the infidels were a blessing for all humanity. A religion without war is an incomplete religion. This is not the conscious mind speaking, but a mind that has been possessed by the primordial instinct of the predator. Because he was the spiritual leader of Iran, his words had the power to activate shadow projections in millions of his followers, inciting the collective hatred of the despised infidel that was carried forward in the next generation by Osama bin Laden. In the Middle Ages, similar beliefs were being disseminated in Europe. The call to rescue the Holy Land was proclaimed by Christian popes to be the will of God, activating exactly the same kind of negative projection onto Muslims and leading to the massacre in the Fourth Crusade of the entire population of Constantinople. It was in this era that there arose the idea of the just war, building on foundations laid by St. Augustine and defined by Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274. The 20th century was one of monstrous slaughter, without question, as the historian Neil Ferguson writes, the bloodiest century in history, far more violent in relative as well as absolute terms than any previous era. Significantly larger percentages of the world's population were killed in the two world wars that dominated the century than had been killed in any previous conflict of comparable geopolitical magnitude. Tens of millions were traumatized by the loss of their parents, children, and families, by terror, horror, starvation, and suffering. These wounds do not die with those who have suffered them. They live on in the memory fields of the collective unconscious of our species. No one has detailed the indescribable suffering of civilians in war more comprehensively than Max Hastings in his harrowing and moving book, All Hell Let Loose, The World at War, 1939 to 1945. 3 other recent books have vividly and poignantly described the effects of war on ordinary individuals: The Beauty and the Sorrow by Peter Englund, The Quick and the Dead by Richard Van Emden, and Savage Continent, Europe in the Aftermath of World War II by Keith Lowe. At the end of the Nuremberg trials, a lawyer commented, "This trial has shown that no nations can engage in aggressive war any longer." At that time, as at the end of the Second World War, we thought we had fought the war to end all wars, and nobly halted the tide of persecution and suffering, had saved Christian civilization from barbarism. 60 years later, we have become embroiled in another major war, Iraq and Afghanistan, this time with very dubious justification, drawing the West into confrontation with the whole Muslim world. At the dawn of a new millennium, we stand on the edge of an abyss, witnesses to further conflict, further atrocities. We have not learned to think in a new way. The archaic roots of war. The last chapter explained how the instinctive reflexes of the reptilian and mammalian brain, formed over millions of years, can easily take over the far more recently developed neocortical levels of the brain. These unconscious survival and territorial instincts, deeply embedded in the autonomic nervous system, may control us in any situation which arouses fear. Once they are aroused, they can drive us to actions that our rational mind, in another context, would deplore. Then, if the situation demands it, politicians who have never experienced the horror of war will call for the sacrifice of young men and women, and these will courageously and patriotically respond to the call of their leaders to offer their lives in sacrifice, and to sacrifice other men and, if necessary, women and children, in order to ensure the survival of the group to which they belong. These instinctive drives are intrinsic to the training of the armed forces in any nation-state. The training to obey orders without question, and to strive for victory at all costs. Superimposed on this primordial behavior pattern, there is the male fear of losing face, of backing down from confrontation, of being shamed and humiliated in the eyes of other men or nations, and there is also the sense of honor involved in securing victory rather than suffering the ignominy of defeat. The primal male in any given group is watched obsessively by other males for any sign of weakness or incompetence, any flaw which might reveal him to be a weak or vacillating leader in times of war. Any such weakness or flaw is vigorously exposed and attacked, for the strength of the leader is identified with the survival of the group. The mass of the people, when survival instincts are aroused in them by their leaders, will support a belligerent response to attack. Nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. Weapons that were unimaginable 100 years ago, operated by remote control thousands of miles distant from their target, can now obliterate the lives of millions of helpless civilians and devastate vast swathes of the Earth's surface, effectively sending survivors back to the Stone Age. In the last 60 years, nations have armed themselves with truly cosmic forces of destruction, without any apparent awareness of the enormous evil they have unleashed. Matthew Fox spoke truly when he wrote in his book, Original Blessing, that the deepest of all demonic activity is the use of our divine imaginations to invent destruction. The splitting of the atom was the most monumental scientific project of the 20th century, delivering, as a post-war news announcement proclaimed, limitless power into the hands of man. The application of this discovery to the dark alchemy of nuclear weaponry has been a constant presence since the bomb was first used as a weapon in 1945 in the obliteration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was an act of inconceivable aggression against civilians, of whom 75,000 died immediately from the bomb itself, and as many again within 2 weeks from radiation sickness. The bomb that fell on Nagasaki destroyed, apart from the city itself, 18 schools and universities, with thousands of students inside them. This act reflects the dualistic thinking which arose from the split between spirit and nature during the solar era. Our growing capacity to disassociate thinking from feeling and mind from soul led us to that fateful moment and to the sequence of decisions and events which have followed on from it. Exulting in the triumph of wresting from nature the new-found power of atomic energy to serve the degenerate aims of man, and knowing nothing of the chain of ideas that had led to the kind of thinking that could encourage political leaders to embark on this course of action, people could not comprehend what an act of sacrilege had been committed against nature, matter, and the sacred order of life. Only the ego-inflation of the solar age could have led to this act of hubris. The horrifying effects on human beings and the utter destruction of cities were written off as the inevitable price of war and the need to defeat an enemy. Throughout the 80s, when the threat of nuclear war hung over humanity, only a handful of people, ridiculed by the established powers and accused of supporting the communist regime in the Soviet Union, offered an alternative view. Now, with the West and Israel, which have nuclear weapons, worried by the possibility of Iran becoming a nuclear power, and by the paranoid regime of North Korea brandishing its weapons, the inevitable consequences of that act of hubris are clearly apparent, since it has drawn other nations to follow the example of the United States. The genie is out of the bottle, and no threats will get it back in again. The current perilous situation with regard to Iran's nuclear ambitions reflects nothing so much as the failure of world leaders, after some 67 years of the existence of these weapons, to pursue the aim of dismantling the whole arsenal of them. Nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction are the culmination of the shadow aspect of the solar age and its glorification of war and weaponry. Their invention and use reflect a consciousness which sees matter divorced from spirit and, unbelievably, takes pride in the fact that man now has the power to transform matter into a force of pure destruction. The words of Robert Oppenheimer, the Prometheus who brought us the atomic bomb, warned us of the dangers of attempting to master matter. Speaking to an audience of the American Philosophical Society, he said, "We have made a thing, a most terrible weapon, that has altered abruptly and profoundly the nature of the world, a thing that by all the standards of the world we grew up in is an evil thing, and by so doing we have raised again the question of whether science is good for man." Thanks to the remarkable research carried out by David Hoffman and presented in his book The Dead Hand, Reagan, Gorbachev, and the Untold Story of the Cold War Arms Race, we now know that by 1982, the combined nuclear strategic arsenals of the two superpowers held the explosive power of approximately 1 million Hiroshimas. Even this was not enough for the Soviet regime. Its leaders drew up plans for a system that would guarantee a retaliatory strike, a fully automatic system known as the Dead Hand, in which a computer alone would issue the order to launch. While nuclear weapons were the overwhelming threat of the epoch, Hoffman writes that another lethal weapon of mass murder was being grown in flasks and fermenters. From 1975 to 1991, the Soviet Union covertly built the largest biological weapons program in the world. Soviet scientists experimented with genetic engineering to create pathogens which could cause unstoppable diseases. If the order came, Soviet factory directors were ready to produce bacteria by the ton that could sicken and kill millions of people. Although in 1975 a treaty, the Biological and Toxins Weapons Convention, came into force, signed by more than 70 nations, including the United States and the Soviet Union, which banned the development and production of biological weapons and the means of delivering them, the Soviet Union continued covertly to expand its biological weapons program, called Biopreparat, under the cover of a civilian enterprise. The Soviet program grew and grew into a dark underside of the arms race. Gorbachev was unable to confront the power of the military priesthood, which controlled the development of biological weapons. Chemical weapons were also manufactured and stockpiled as part of this program, and concealed in industrial and agricultural compounds. Incredibly, this program to develop a new generation of even more deadly chemical weapons was secretly pursued by the military without knowledge of the Soviet government, thereby betraying the genuine assurances given to the West by Gorbachev and Yeltsin that this program had been halted. By the end of the Cold War, the United States had amassed 31,000 tons of chemical agents, and the Soviet Union 40,000 tons. Great Britain, as it was then known, had also stockpiled them. Furthermore, from 1959 until 1992, the Soviet Union dumped nuclear waste and reactors into the Arctic Ocean, Barents and Kara Seas. 12 submarine reactors, 6 of them containing fuel, were discarded, even though the Soviet Union had signed an international treaty that prohibited dumping waste in the oceans. We owe a great debt to David Hoffman for detailing these facts. I have reported some of them here because I have been so shocked by them, and because they show the still unrecognized dangers of corporate military thinking that were so clearly described in Carol Cohn's paper in Chapter 12. Now there is a whole new generation of what we call tactical nuclear weapons. They are much smaller than earlier nuclear bombs, and when detonated they look like ordinary explosions. At the present time, there are still some 17,000 nuclear warheads in existence, poised and ready for use, enough to incinerate the entire population of the planet several times over. Around 1,800 US and Russian warheads are on high alert, able to be launched within about 45 minutes or less of the warning of an attack. They can travel in the stratosphere at a speed of 1,000 miles every 4 minutes, and are undetectable save by electronic sensors. Heads of government and chiefs of staff have 10 to 15 minutes to decide if we are really under attack after receipt of electronic information that we are. American arsenals include nuclear weapons with a destructive power of 455,000 tons of high explosive, 30 times the destructive power of the Hiroshima bomb. Some Russian weapons have a destructive power of more than twice this figure. In the United Kingdom, the Trident missile system carries 100 kiloton warheads, each having around 7 times the destructive power of the Hiroshima bomb. It is not only the lethal power of the bombs themselves that is a danger to humanity, but the radioactive clouds released by them, which could be active for thousands of years, condemning to death people hundreds or even thousands of miles distant from the actual explosion, and affecting future generations. The Earth and its millions of species have already been exposed to the radiation of nuclear bombs set off in the Pacific between 1946 and 1963, before we were aware of the long-term effects of these bombs. Veterans who were exposed to these explosions are still trying to claim compensation for their cancers and other illnesses. For over 50 years, the concentration on the development of nuclear weapons, first and foremost by the United States and the Soviet Union, but also by the United Kingdom, France, Israel, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and now possibly Iran, has brought into being the very situation that is most feared, the ability of a nation, group, or deranged individual to destroy life on an apocalyptic scale. The struggle of these nations for military supremacy and control has become a lethal pursuit of colossal excess, and the devouring greed for power that reveals a state of possession of the conscious mind by primordial instincts. Yet, because they are still believed to act as a deterrent, nations cannot and will not give up nuclear weapons, although America and Russia have recently, START Treaty 2011, agreed to reduce the stockpile of nuclear weapons they hold to 1,550. The residue of Russia's biological warfare program during the Cold War remains an ever-present danger, even greater since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when some of the huge stocks of biological and chemical weapons stored in Kazakhstan were accessible to impoverished Russian scientists, who set up a highly lucrative black market selling nerve gas to Syria and other lethal toxins and materials to Iran. Syria has the largest stockpile of chemical weapons in the Middle East. Israel is now threatened by the stores of mustard gas, sarin, and cyanide gas, which have apparently been incorporated into artillery shells, chemical bombs, and warheads for Scud missiles. Syria's cooperation with Hezbollah makes the danger of these weapons being used against Israel a very real one, and its government has issued its citizens with gas masks as a precaution. In chapter 22 of his book, Hoffman writes, "Years had gone by since the Soviet collapse, yet pathogens in flasks, unguarded fissile materials, idle weapons, scientists, and marooned defense factories were still being discovered for the first time in the late 1990s. These weapons, that are the residual legacy of the Cold War, are still with us today. They are, as he rightly says, the dead hand of our time, a lethal machine that haunts the globe long after the demise of the men who created it. What is truly alarming is that a single individual who has access to the technology of destruction, whether nuclear, biological, or chemical, now has the power to destroy the lives of tens of millions, because he believes that the use of these weapons in a preemptive strike against a designated enemy is justified, or because he sees himself as the agent of God in eliminating his enemies from the world and instituting a new order. A nuclear missile gives no protection against a single file of deadly pathogens or chemical toxins. From the perspective of the values defined in Chapter 10, the actual development as well as the proposed use of these weapons is a betrayal of these values, and is, as stated at the beginning of this chapter, a crime against the sacred order of life itself. The genesis of this evil is to be found in the drive to accumulate arms, to stockpile ever more lethal weapons, as well as in the corporate mentality that holds us in bondage to instinctive habits of defense and attack that have been built into the human psyche for millennia. There still appear to be millions of people who are proud of their nation's weapons and prowess in war, even making the ludicrous claim that God is on their side. Millions approve of their nation being powerful in relation to others. Military and commercial rivalry between powerful nations like America, Russia, and China are accepted as normal. The race to control the resources of the Arctic and the mineral wealth of Africa is the most recent example of this primitive mentality. The devil's repertoire. Yet millions of other people long for release from this scenario of ongoing rivalry and conflict. Victor Galantz, writing in 1956 in a book called The Devil's Repertoire, gave the ultimate condemnation of nuclear weapons. To drop a nuclear bomb in any circumstances whatever, he said, would be the final iniquity, final in the sense that no more abominable iniquity is possibly conceivable by the mind of man, sheer unqualified evil. For what else would it be than the ultimate rejection of spirit, a total abandonment by the men who did it of any last vestige of sympathy with their fellow creatures, and the conversion of their own beings as a matter of deliberate choice into instruments for the unspeakable torture of millions upon millions. I was appalled when I heard that India had developed the nuclear bomb, because it suggested to me that she, like the nations of the Christian West, had turned her back on her great spiritual heritage. The demands of a nation's perceived survival needs can override an ancient lineage of spiritual values. What, incredibly, is celebrated by politicians as a great good is in fact a great evil. Arundhati Roy asks in her book, The Algebra of Infinite Justice, whether the Indian people have any understanding of the monstrous implications of what was decided in their name, and asks, who the hell is the Prime Minister to decide whose finger will be on the nuclear button that could turn everything we love, our earth, our skies, our mountains, our plains, our rivers, our cities and villages, to ash in an instant? Is it possible for people who cannot write their own names to understand even the basic, elementary facts about the nature of nuclear weapons? Has anybody bothered to explain to them about thermal blast, radioactive fallout, and the nuclear winter? Are there even words in their language to describe the concepts of enriched uranium, fissile material, and critical mass? Or has their language become obsolete? Are they trapped in a time capsule, watching the world pass by, unable to understand or communicate with it because their language never took into account the horrors that the human race could dream up? Do they not matter at all? In the same chapter, The End of Imagination, she writes, it is such supreme folly to believe that nuclear weapons are deadly only if they're used. The fact that they exist at all, their very presence in our lives, will wreak more havoc than we can begin to fathom. Nuclear weapons pervade our thinking, control our behavior, administer our societies, inform our dreams. They bury themselves like meat hooks deep in the base of our brains. The nuclear bomb is the most anti-democratic, anti-national, anti-human, outright evil thing that man has ever made. Through it, man now has the power to destroy God's creation. Man as predator. The latest weapon is the guided missile or unmanned drone, named by the United States as the most precise weapon in the history of warfare, and now used extensively by it in its war against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Waziristan. Despite official denials, it has been responsible for many civilian casualties. Since 2004, the United States has launched more than 300 drone strikes in Pakistan, killing more than 2,000 people, among them many civilians, although this is denied by the US government. Among these was a boy, Tariq Aziz, aged 16, the age of my grandson, who died with his younger cousin as they travelled by car to an aunt's house in a village in Waziristan, after he had attended a meeting reporting the effect of drone strikes on civilians. They were killed by a Hellfire missile, note the name, 200 yards from her door, possibly as a result of a GPS tracking device secretly attached to his car by a CIA informant. Tariq's uncle, expressing his anger and distress, said, "What have these two little boys done to the Americans?" The men who control and launch these weapons no doubt consider themselves to be Christians. It is a pity the so-called Christian West has no concept of karma. All this is not viewed as a symptom of insanity, but is considered perfectly acceptable by the United States and its allies in the interests of defense. It will not be long before other countries develop and use these lethal weapons discharged by remote control, by operatives thousands of miles from their target, operatives who will feel no guilt for the lives they will extinguish with technological precision by focusing on their target. The hapless victims of these unmanned executions, whether militant, civilian, or child, are known in the military jargon associated with these attacks as bug splats. Would the Buddha have seen this as right livelihood? The arms trade, a shadow world. Arms sales are another aspect of the drive for military supremacy already mentioned in the last chapter. The arms trade is dangerous, corrupting, and amoral. The United States has the highest number of arms sales, followed by the United Kingdom, worth £5 billion a year. Sales of arms have consistently been made to autocratic regimes in North Africa, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa, where the abuse of human rights is known to have taken place and is still ongoing. Arms sales by the United Kingdom to repressive regimes in Arab countries increased 27% between 2010 and 2011. This is not something to be proud of, but, on the contrary, is a cause for deep shame and condemnation, as Andrew Feinstein's book, The Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade, 2011, suggests. He reveals the morally corrupt nature of this trade, which draws into its net every powerful state that sells arms to impoverished countries, enriching corrupt leaders and enabling them to oppress their people. And he comments, a basic commitment to universal rights, equality, and justice, to the belief that it is better to save a life by feeding a hungry stomach than to take a life by producing another deadly weapon, demands that this trade, one of the most destructive and corrupting in human history, cannot be allowed to continue in its largely unregulated, unscrutinized current form. The fact that governments engage in this lucrative arms trade, disowning any responsibility for ultimately killing and wounding civilians in other countries, who may, like the citizens of Libya, Syria, and Bahrain, rise up against their oppressive ruling elite, is a further example of the pathology of war. Governments exhibit the same psychopathology as individuals: paranoia, projection, denial, splitting, delusional certainty. But all this is screened out because arms sales are deemed acceptable in the context of defense, contributing to the GDP of a nation, or providing employment. How is it possible to call ourselves human and participate in the invention and manufacture of all these weapons, let alone their sale and use? How have we fallen into such a demonic misuse of our great creative powers, a self-inflicted rape of our soul? There is surely a schizoid split in the mind of each one of us when we passively acquiesce in this situation, because of the protection it seems to offer us, or because we leave it to governments to decide what to do. Evil has the power to seduce and delude, because a course of action or failure to take action can be justified by all kinds of political rationalizations. By acceptance, we become complicit in the potential murder of helpless civilians. To summarize, the conviction that it is justifiable to murder others in defense of one's own group or territory, with God co-opted to support that group, has evolved out of the belief system and territorial tribal habits of the past. The efforts of the great spiritual teachers of all religious traditions have attempted to free us from our enslavement to these primordial habits, defining the values that we should aspire to follow. But their fundamental message, that life is sacred and, at the deepest level, one and indivisible, has consistently been ignored. They would view the invention of our weapons of destruction in the interests of self-defense, or maintaining the balance of power, and our proposed use of them to destroy the lives of innocent people in order to save our own lives, as morally inconceivable. Believing that the sacrifice of a single life could be pleasing to God would be unimaginable. That is why the revered Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh, speaking from this unfamiliar perspective, urges us not to kill, not to let others kill, and to find whatever means possible to protect life and to prevent war. On a more positive note, a recent one-line initiative, 2011, asked for signatures to declare nuclear weapons a war crime. www.nuclearweapons-warcrimes.org. As long ago as 1948, General Omar Bradley summed up in a speech the moral immaturity of the Christian West. We have grasped the mystery of the atom and rejected the Sermon on the Mount. Ours is a world of nuclear giants and ethical infants. We know more about war than we know about peace. more about killing than we know about living. He also said, "If we continue to develop our weaponry without wisdom or prudence, our servant may prove to be our executioner." The cost of war. Governments pour incredible sums of money into the maintenance and renewal of weapons. Wars generate huge profits for a few individuals and corporate bodies. But the actual financial cost of war and the weapons required to wage it or to be dedicated to defense falls on the general population whose work generates the taxes that are used to pay for them. The accumulation of arms is a burden on every country that indulges in it, because it wastes colossal sums that could otherwise be spent on raising the standard of living of those least able to help themselves. One example is the huge final cost of renewing the Trident missile system in the United Kingdom. The cost of building a new submarine fleet to carry the nuclear warheads is estimated by the United Kingdom government to be £20 to £25 billion. CND and Greenpeace put the estimated cost of replacing the current system at more than £100 billion. If the £2 billion annual cost of maintaining the existing system together with the replacement system for more than 40 years is factored into this estimate. Global military expenditure in 2010 amounted to $1.61 trillion. In 2011, $1.74 trillion and is rising. The United States spends $700 billion annually on defense, and the estimated cost to it for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is estimated at $1.5 trillion, although the actual cost is thought to be twice that after taking into account payments to the families of the bereaved and the ongoing care of wounded veterans. There is also the huge cost of maintaining military bases in over 100 different countries. Turning to the United Kingdom by July 2011, the cost of the war in Afghanistan had reached £18 billion. The insanity of all this is reflected in the fact that 2/5 of the Earth's population live on less than $2 a day, and 1 billion are hungry. Imagine the difference that could be made to the destitute and hungry people of the world if the obscene sums spent on wars, arms, military bases and budgets were instead directed to the worldwide distribution of food, healthcare and education. According to the United Nations, $300 billion a year could lift the inhabitants of the planet above the poverty line of $1 a day, and this sum would constitute less than a quarter of the global military budget for 2011. Demonizing the enemy, the manipulation of shadow projections. In any conflict, an essential aspect of mobilizing collective opinion to justify the regression to predatory or pathological behavior is the demonizing or dehumanizing of the enemy, and the presentation of the conflict as a simplistic one between victory and defeat, good and evil, right and wrong, thereby effectively polarizing two groups or nations and transforming them into enemies. Strategic lying to promote the national interests. Strategic lying to promote national interests has long been part of the repertoire of political leaders, and fear-mongering is part and parcel of this repertoire. But it is precisely in these situations that we risk falling under the polarizing spell of solar mythology and into a state of possession by the unconscious shadow. Totalitarianism follows on from the process of demonizing another group, naming one group as good and the other as evil. The good group may be trying to hold down another within a nation, as in modern Syria, or it may be trying to control another nation that presents a threat to it, as in India or Pakistan, or it may be reacting against a future imagined threat, as with the United States and the United Kingdom, and the threat posed by Saddam Hussein. Then the belief is promoted: if our group or nation is to win, the other must be defeated, eliminated. If our cause is identified with good, the other must be evil and is, therefore, deserving of defeat, however great the sacrifice, ours and theirs. There is no third way. Barbaric acts are justified on both sides as a necessary means to victory. Few governments mention or mourn the loss of life on the enemy side, only those lost on our side. In 4,000 years, little has changed. In a situation of conflict where survival instincts are aroused, the leader of a nation, or primal male, is expected to don the garb of the warrior and win the battle for supremacy. Hence George W. Bush's words, "We will settle for nothing less than complete victory," on the 30th of November 2005 to the United States Naval Academy, Annapolis. Jung developed his ideas about the danger of the archetypal power of the shadow to overwhelm civilization in his essays on events in Germany. There he analyzed how negative projections onto others can develop and spread like a virus until they contaminate a whole group or nation, causing it to fall into a psychosis, as they did in Nazi Germany or in Maoist China. One of Jung's most important realizations was that when we project evil onto others, particularly when we feel threatened, we may lose the possibility of insight and the ability to deal with evil, becoming very easily contaminated by it ourselves. He wrote, "We know today that in the unconscious of every individual there are instinctive propensities or psychic systems charged with considerable tension. When they are helped in one way or another to break through into consciousness, and the latter has no opportunity to incept them in higher forms, they sweep everything before them like a torrent, and turn men into creatures for whom the word beast is still too good a name. They can then only be called devils. To evoke such phenomena in the masses, all that is needed is a few possessed persons, or only one. If this unconscious disposition should happen to be one which is common to the great majority of the nation, then a single one of these complex-ridden individuals, who at the same time sets himself up as a megaphone, is enough to precipitate a catastrophe." The most recent and obvious example of shadow projections was the invasion of Iraq by the United States and Britain, ostensibly to eliminate the threat of WMD, developed by the oppressive regime of Saddam Hussein, but in reality, in the view of Mohammed el-Baradei, winner of the Nobel Prize for Peace in 2005 and author of The Age of Deception, Nuclear Diplomacy in Treacherous Times, to change the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East by establishing Iraq as an oasis of democracy. Apart from the number of Allied soldiers killed or maimed in this war, estimates of the number of Iraqi deaths, mainly civilians, caused by it, vary between the figure of 128,000 given by the Iraq Body Count and an earlier report by the Lancet of more than 600,000. In addition, it created hundreds of thousands of seriously injured people, including maimed and traumatized children, who witnessed and suffered unimaginable horror. It displaced between 4 and 7 million people, many of whom became refugees. It left behind a shattered economy and a weak and divided state, torn by rival factions. In his detailed analysis of the events leading up to the invasion of Iraq, Mohammed el-Baradei comments, "Ultimately, the story of the Iraq War may come down to a series of hard-hitting questions. If the community of nations seeks to live by the rule of law, then what steps should be taken when violations of international law result in massive civilian casualties? Who should be held accountable when military action has been taken in contravention of the law as codified in the UN Charter? Or, worse still, when military action is found to have been based on faulty information, the deliberately selective treatment of information, or the promulgation of misinformation? As the compulsion of the West to embark on wars to establish democracy in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other countries in order to protect itself from future attack illustrates, we are in no sense free, rationally directed people, but are still enthralled to ancient habits. John Gray acidly comments in his book Black Mass, Apocalyptic Religion and the Death of Utopia. The attempt to remake the international system has had effects similar to previous utopias. Preserving the hard-won restraints of civilization is less exciting than throwing them away in order to realize impossible dreams. Barbarism has a certain charm, particularly when it comes clothed in virtue. As long as we make no effort to gain an insight into this monumentally dangerous aspect of our shadow behavior, we will be drawn into repeating old patterns. During the Cold War, Jung commented that humanity was split into two apparently irreconcilable halves. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. That is to say, when the individual remains undivided and does not become conscious of his inner opposite, his shadow, the world must perforce act out the conflict and be torn into opposing halves. This unconsciousness of the shadow was reflected in the polarized beliefs of Anders Behring Breivik, which led to the tragic murder of 76 young people on the island of Utøya in July 2011. Faced with that terrible situation, it is noteworthy that the Prime Minister of Norway, together with the majority of the Norwegian people, consciously chose not to respond in a way which could have polarized the country and led to attacks on the Muslim population. Such a conscious decision was an outstanding example of what Jung called the transcendent function, whereby insight is translated into the kind of action that is able to defuse a situation of dangerous tension and counteract the tendency to project darkness and evil onto others. It was an example to the rest of the world. The link between the tendency to project evil onto others and the perpetration of an atrocity has been recognized in Norway, where an intense inquiry was mounted into the role that the often anonymous, hate-filled comments on internet sites about Muslim population may have contributed to encouraging this horrific massacre. It is almost as if a negative thought field can be created, which has its own momentum, and once having reached a certain stage is unstoppable and plays into the hands of a psychopathic individual. For those who are not familiar with Jung's ideas and the implications of ignoring the shadow, we can nevertheless see that his words are as relevant today as they were when the Berlin Wall which divided Germany was built, or when the Iron Curtain was drawn between the Soviet Union and the West during the Cold War. Today we have the ongoing war on terror, the concrete wall built to separate Israel from the Palestinian territories, and the wall bristling with armed men between North and South Korea. We have the interminable lethal hatred between the Sunni and Shia tribal divisions in Islam, and the attempts of Islamists to destroy the cultural and artistic heritage of tribal groups in Africa, Mali. We can imagine that if only they can be eliminated, the world will be a better and safer place. Yet, when that particular hydra head is cut off, two more appear in its place. The problem of evil is an ongoing and cumulative one. Jung's comment here is helpful. Since it is universally believed that man is merely what his consciousness knows of itself, he regards himself as harmless and so adds stupidity to iniquity. He does not deny that terrible things have happened and still go on happening, but it is always the others who do them. The danger of such a situation is that these old age habits do not encourage dialogue with the enemy. Paranoid projections fly back and forth and escalate until each combatant demonizes his enemy. The fear and hatred intrinsic to current conflicts activates memories of older conflicts, even those going back over 1,000 years. When atrocities are committed on both sides, the reflexive impulse to avenge them makes it almost impossible to contain the survival instincts that are aroused. Wherever there is a strong polarization of opposites, there is a situation which attracts shadow projections and the demonizing of others. The scapegoat or demonized individual or enemy group, often named as dogs, pigs, or vermin, carries shadow projections coming from millions of others and relieves us of the responsibility of looking at our own shadow to see where we may have contributed to creating this enemy. Demonizing or dehumanizing an enemy, encouraged by politicians and the media, as well as by fanatical religious leaders, can lead to the situation where the collective mind is flooded with shadow projections. But we can be encouraged by the fact that these shadow motives are being brought to light, because there is now a growing number of people in many countries ready to challenge their government's policies, even if they cannot yet prevent them from being implemented. There are now many organizations such as Liberty in the United Kingdom, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the internet organization Avaaz, www.avaaz.com, which are devoted to shedding light on situations constellated by shadow behavior in governments and corporations. Others, such as Peace Direct and the Oxford Research Group founded by Dr. Scilla Elworthy, are devoted to conflict resolution. Sam Keane, in Faces of the Enemy, gives a brilliant analysis of the way propaganda works and how collective shadow projections are manipulated by governments and the media. Healing begins, he says, when we cease playing the blame game, when we stop assigning responsibility for war to some mysterious external agency and dare to become conscious of our violent ways. He puts his finger on one of our greatest problems, one that has been highlighted by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The most terrible of all the moral paradoxes, the Gordian knot that must be unraveled if history is to continue, is that we create evil out of our highest ideals and most noble aspirations. We so need to be heroic, to be on the side of God, to eliminate evil, to clean up the world, to be victorious over death, that we visit destruction and death on all who stand in the way of our heroic historical destiny. Political leaders carry and unconsciously act out the collective shadow of the past, perpetuating it in the present. Millions collude with their projections because they look to a leader for security when they are told they are in danger and survival instincts are aroused. Government and media propaganda compounds both the fear and the illusion of safety. To withdraw these projections and see clearly what the shadow is doing counteracts its power, freeing us from being possessed by it. We have enough consciousness to make this choice, to shed light on our own darkness. This involves dissociating ourselves as individuals from the rhetoric of patriotic or religious beliefs that, far from eliminating evil, engender it. Patriotism and religious conformity have long been promoted as the supreme virtues, but now we need to look beyond these to a more inclusive morality, which invites awareness of the needs of the whole human community, as well as the planetary environment. In Jung's highly significant words, the immunity of the nation depends entirely upon the existence of a leading minority immune to the evil and capable of combating the powerful suggestive effect of seemingly possible wish fulfillments. If the leader is not absolutely immune, he will inevitably fall a victim to his own will to power. Mark Jerson, in a brilliantly argued book, Leading Through Conflict, shows that the demonizing of the other is one of the main roots of evil. Holocaust and genocide never, repeat, never happen without lies about an evil other. A single human being may hurt or even kill another human being. But in order to kill 100, 1,000, and certainly hundreds of thousands, the victims must be turned into something sub- or non-human. Demagogues are often twisted geniuses when it comes to the brutal craft of dehumanization. They are brilliant at portraying those who fall outside the boundaries of us, as less than human. The demagogue never simply leads Group A without systematically demonizing and often destroying Group B. He justifies his fixation on the enemy with all sorts of sophisticated rationales, including self-defense. But what marks the demagogue is that his leadership actually depends on, and is energized by, the existence of a hated other. Apart from the dehumanizing of Jews as a precursor to their elimination, there have been many other cases where dehumanizing or demonizing the hated other has been a precursor to genocide, as in Communist China and Cambodia, Ottoman Turkey, Armenians, Bosnia, Muslims, and Rwanda, Tutsis. Wherever negative projections and the demonizing of others are encouraged to proliferate and take root, the archetypal power of solar myth can become active, take possession of millions of people, and lead to acts of unspeakable barbarism. Leaders have long known that deflecting people's attention from domestic problems onto an outside threat can work wonders for strengthening their power or supporting their decision to embark on a war, even as with President Assad in Syria, a civil war with their own people. The mass of the people, when roused to survival mode by its leaders, will accept and even call for a belligerent attack. Goering was well aware of this when he cynically observed, "Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia nor in England, nor for that matter in Germany. That is understood. But after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship, or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked, and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism, and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in any country." The crimes of war. Effects on the environment and the planet. One of the crimes of war that is rarely commented on is the devastation of the landscape, as well as the destruction of a culture and its precious buildings, libraries, and museums. As Milan Kundera writes in the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, the first step in liquidating a people is to erase its memory, destroy its books, its culture, its history. Then you have somebody write new books, manufacture a new culture, invent a new history. Before long, the nation will begin to forget what it is and what it was. Those engaged in the ferocious battle for Aleppo are destroying the priceless heritage not only of their nation, but of all humanity. The devastation of the environment by invasion and bombing is one aspect of war. But there are other effects, such as the long-term effects of weapons like depleted uranium on the soil, as well as on human beings and animals. The distinguished biologist Dr. Rosalie Bertel, in her book Planet Earth, The Latest Weapon of War, comments, "War results in immediate deaths and destruction, but the environmental consequences can last hundreds, often thousands of years. And it is not just war itself that undermines our life support system, but also the research and development, military exercises, and general preparation for battle that are carried out on a daily basis in most parts of the world. The majority of this pre-war activity takes place without the benefit of civilian scrutiny, and therefore we are unaware of some of what is being done to our environment in the name of security." She also warns of a new generation of weapons that are designed to interfere with the Earth's electromagnetic atmosphere, or penetrate deep below its surface into its magnetic field. Projects such as HAARP, High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, whose first stage in Alaska was completed in 1995, are designed to use the ionosphere which envelops the Earth to reflect beams of ultra-high energy to destroy targets across the globe. Such weapons, she says, are capable of interfering with the dynamic equilibrium of the Earth's support systems and life forms, of which we are one. When HARP is completed, it will be able to warm specific areas of the ionosphere until they produce a curved-shaped lens capable of redirecting significant amounts of electromagnetic energy. These reflected electromagnetic beams may be in the microwave or ultraviolet range and could be used as a weapon either to incinerate a forest or oil reserve or to selectively kill living things. Few of us can even begin to comprehend the danger to ourselves and to all humanity which attends the development of this kind of weapon. According to her research, interference with the ionosphere and the manipulation of electromagnetic waves may result in the creation of unusually violent storms, as well as earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The people of the world are not aware of the existence of these initiatives, or the colossal sums of their money spent by governments on developing them. At present, humanity as a whole has no power to stop this appalling waste of money, since each nation controls its own military budget and projects. What is at present missing is the implementation of the Earth Charter and a global initiative for the protection of the planetary environment and all the species it sustains. This is an absolute necessity for the future. War and the Soul. There are not many books on the effects of war on the soul. One of the most profound has been written by the Jungian analyst Edward Tick, who has devoted his life to treating traumatized veterans of war, in particular the Vietnam War. In his book, War and the Soul, Healing Our Nation's Veterans from Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, he writes that veterans can be haunted for years by reliving in nightmares the original terrifying experiences they underwent. They may see themselves killing again, or friends and enemies dying again. They may have waking visions of dead friends, enemies, or both. They may also, in retrospect, feel moral anguish that the people they killed did not deserve to die. They may have nightmares, insomnia, frightening mood swings and surges of anger in response to something that to others would seem innocuous. They may have to endure living their young lives without the limbs that have been amputated, without sight if they have been blinded, without the capacity to develop into the full potential of what they might have been. All this gives rise to intolerable anguish and suffering both for veterans and their families, which can endure for years. Sometimes these symptoms do not manifest for many years after the original traumatic experience. He writes, though hostilities cease and life moves on, and though loved ones yearn for their healing, veterans often remain drenched in the imagery and emotion of war for decades, and sometimes for their entire lives. For these survivors, every vital human characteristic that we attribute to the soul may be fundamentally reshaped. These traits include how we perceive, how our minds are organized and function, how we love and relate, what we believe, expect, and value, what we feel and refuse to feel, and what we judge as good or evil, right or wrong. Though the affliction that today we call post-traumatic stress disorder has had many names over the centuries, it is always the result of the way war invades, wounds, and transforms our spirit. As he explores the effects of war on the soul and explains the reasons why post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is so difficult to treat, he writes, the traumatic impact of war and violence inflicts wounds so deep we need to address them with extraordinary attention, resources, and methods. Conventional methods of medical and psychological functioning and therapeutics are not adequate to explain or treat such wounds. Veterans and their afflictions try to tell us so. A recent report by the U.S. Army's Public Health Command says that in veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Suicides increased by 80% between 2003 and 2008, and the rates of mental illness doubled. The number of suicides recorded in 2012 presents a death toll 50% higher than the number of US personnel killed in action in Afghanistan over the same period. Dr. Tick explains why these symptoms of unbearable stress are to be expected in survivors of trauma. War devastates not only our physical being, but our very soul, for the entire culture as well as for the individual. In war, chaos overwhelms compassion, violence replaces cooperation, instinct replaces rationality, gut dominates mind. When drenched in these conditions, the soul is disfigured and can become lost for life. What is called soul loss is an extreme psycho-spiritual condition beyond what psychologists commonly call dissociation. It is far more than psychic numbing or separation of mind from body. It is a removal of the center of experience from the living body without completely snapping the connection. In the presence of overwhelming, life-threatening violence, the soul, the true self, flees. The center of experience shifts. The body takes the impact of the trauma but does not register it as deeply as before. With body and soul separated, a person is trapped in a limbo where past and present intermingle without differentiation or continuity. Nothing feels right until body and soul rejoin. Psychotherapists know that the victim of trauma repeats the traumatizing pattern in ongoing life situations. I think this insight could be applied to the life of humanity as a whole. The memories of conflict and the suffering engendered through past conflicts do not go away with the coming of new generations. They are held in the collective unconscious of the species, ready to be activated when specific triggers call forth the same response. Tick concludes that as long as we remain unaware of the unconscious elements that drive us, we will not be able to release ourselves from their power over us. We will continue to be possessed by what James Hillman described as the terrible love of war in his book of that name, until we become conscious of how easily it can take us over and are able to resist its powerful spell. We might then develop strategies to contain it so that it can no longer destroy our soul. It has been found that one of the most effective treatments for traumatized veterans suffering from PTSD is EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. The way forward. The mass of humanity unconsciously follows the dual tracks of tribal or social custom and religious belief that were established centuries, even millennia ago. Conformity is safer. To resist the call to war is to be branded unpatriotic and invites shame and ridicule. Yet, the maturation and even the survival of humanity as a whole depend on courageous individuals opening new pathways for the species to follow. No pattern of behavior is more resistant to change than the survival instincts that are triggered by fear. It is these instincts, together with the intoxication of power in leaders manipulating these fears, and the pressure exerted by the military-industrial complex in nations aiming for world domination, that lead to war. Only by bringing these deeply buried instincts into our conscious awareness can we hope to attain a transcendent perspective that could eventually lift us out of the tragic compulsion to repeat the patterns of the past. At the present time, this transcendent perspective is carried by the organizations such as the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and by governments and individuals intervening to mediate between disaffected parties. But the United Nations, as recent events in relation to Syria have revealed, has been rendered impotent to prevent the massacre of civilians there, because Russia and China blocked the resolution of the Security Council to intervene. As the head of the United Nations General Assembly commented, March 2012, the Security Council is not fit for purpose. There are a few million individuals who are thinking transnationally, in terms of the well-being of all people and the life system of the entire planet. They are working to bring a new kind of civilization into being, a planetary civilization, but not a planetary government, that would truly honor the well-being of all people and all species of life on Earth. The hope for the future lies with those individuals who have the courage to speak up against the whole ethos of war, who shame nations which promote this ideology, who develop existing methods of conflict resolution, and hold politicians to account for embarking on a course of action which can only lead to further enmity and conflict, even to unforeseen catastrophe. Cyber war threatens us with a whole new area of conflict, and the ability of one nation to paralyze another by closing down its electronic systems. The impending threat of an attack on Iran by Israel, or the United States to prevent its developing a nuclear bomb, is a situation where a measure of choice still exists to stop us sleepwalking into another war that would have disastrous consequences for the whole world, including Israel. From the perspective of this book, the discoveries emerging from quantum physics suggest that the belief we can achieve a position of dominance in relation to nature, life, or each other is ultimately an illusion. Each of us is an expression of a vast sea or holographic field of consciousness, as yet barely recognized by us. We are all connected to each other, part of a great living web of life. We are, literally, our brother's keeper. The belief that modern states can continue indefinitely to act as if they were autonomous units, competing with each other to gain control of the Earth's resources, or to acquire the power to destroy life on a colossal scale, is not only the most insidious of illusions, but an unacknowledged pathology. Militarism itself is a pathogen that could wipe us out. In destroying others, or even imagining and rehearsing the destruction of others through the invention and development of ever more terrible weapons, we are, in effect, inviting our own destruction and injuring all humanity, not to mention the planet. In seeking reconciliation and the well-being of others, resisting, even in the midst of conflict, the instinct to retaliate, we are contributing to our own well-being and ensuring that of future generations. Each individual who holds this perspective assists the process of humanity as a whole, awakening to and acting from these utterly different values. Mohammed El-Baradei sums up this unfamiliar perspective in The Age of Deception. Imagine what would happen if the nations of the world spent as much on development as on building the machines of war. Imagine a world where every human being would live in freedom and dignity. Imagine a world in which we would shed the same tears when a child dies in Darfur or Vancouver. Imagine a world where we would settle our differences through diplomacy and dialogue, and not through bombs or bullets. Imagine if the only nuclear weapons remaining were the relics in our museum. Imagine the legacy we could leave to our children. Imagine that such a world is within our grasp. In 2002, I received this dream from a colleague in America, sent to her by one of her clients who had the dream shortly after 9/11. I am back in the army, assigned once again in my old role as a sharpshooter. I have all my equipment and I am methodically putting it together, preparing to shoot my target, who is some distance away. Finally, I get the telescopic sight attached to the gun and trained on my target so that I can actually see who it is, and, to my great surprise, it is my brother. who in real life is in another branch of the service. I am shocked and stopped in my tracks. I can't continue.
If only we could take the message of this dream to our hearts, something might begin to change in the pattern of aggression and war that is so deeply embedded in our psyche. War that is embarked on to serve a nationalistic need for aggrandizement needs to be viewed as a psychotic episode in the national psyche, a betrayal of the soul, where the fragile layer of rational consciousness is overwhelmed by the irrational depths of the unconscious shadow and co-opted into serving its atavistic aims. It is a pathology that is to be deplored and avoided if at all possible, rather than presented as an opportunity to win victory over a designated enemy, or to act as the world's policeman. Jung's warning to us is relevant here.
The supreme danger which threatens individuals as well as whole nations is a psychic danger. Reason has proved itself completely powerless, precisely because its arguments have an effect only on the conscious mind and not on the unconscious. The greatest danger of all comes from the masses in whom the effects of the unconscious pile up cumulatively, and the reasonableness of the conscious mind is stifled. It is therefore in the highest degree desirable that a knowledge of psychology should spread, so that men can understand the source of the supreme dangers that threaten them. Not by arming to the teeth, each for itself, can the nations defend themselves in the long run from the frightful catastrophes of modern war. The heaping up of arms is itself a call to war. Rather, they must recognize those psychic conditions which, under the unconscious, bursts the dikes of consciousness and overwhelms it.
When the survival instincts and the solar mythology which lie at the root of this ancient pathology are recognized, and the unconscious control they exercise over us is acknowledged and addressed, we will find a way to relinquish our addiction to war and the depravity and devastation it engenders. There will be an end to this pattern when a different caliber of leader comes forward, a leader capable of articulating values which draw the highest spiritual response rather than the atavistic one from the people he or she represents. This would be a leader who offers a transcendent planetary perspective on the issues involved, who would serve the needs, acknowledge the wounds, and allay the fears of both peoples in the conflict situation, rather than polarizing them in ever more lethal conflict. Such leaders will emerge as we relinquish the illusion that our own security as a nation, or even the world's security, can be bought at the price of the sacrifice of the lives of others. As we recognize that such a belief, though still tenaciously held by many, must ultimately become obsolete. Things will only begin to change when we can acknowledge that the darkness we project onto others may be our own.
General Eisenhower has written, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. The world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron." Postscript. It is possible that people caught up in a conflict are influenced by those who have died atrocious deaths and are still bound to this earthly dimension by the terror, grief, hatred, and anguish in which they died. A number of individuals trained in spirit release are engaged in helping these traumatized souls. But this practice could be extended if there were a greater understanding that the dead may need release from the trauma of their deaths. a worldwide mass could be simultaneously held in many countries to release the souls of the dead. Part 5. A New Vision of Reality. Chapter 14. A Metaphysical Revolution. Science and a Conscious Universe. The intuitive mind is a sacred gift. The rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. Albert Einstein. In modern scientific man, evolution is becoming conscious of itself. Julian Huxley. Science cannot solve the ultimate mystery of nature, and that is because, in the last analysis, we ourselves are part of nature and therefore part of the mystery that we are trying to solve. Max Planck. Life is ceaseless discovery. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. The Future of Man. Science has given us a fantastic new story, the story of the evolution of the universe, and the story of ourselves as witnessing and participating in an unfolding cosmic drama. The discoveries made by the Hubble telescope, as well as the discovery that the universe came into being 13.7 billion years ago, have utterly transformed our perspective on the evolution of cosmic and planetary life and our own origins. Edwin Hubble, 1889 to 1953, has been compared to a new Copernicus, and the famous telescope he developed has revealed a universe that is not only incredibly vast and incredibly strange, even terrifying in its immensity, but also breathtakingly beautiful, as if painted by a cosmic artist of unparalleled genius. The view of our planet from the moon, the ever-expanding dimensions of the universe, the ongoing complexity of the subatomic world, and the story of the biological evolution of life on this planet may all be called revelations. It is almost as if the cosmos is speaking to us, telling us the story of how it came into being, how we came into being, and it is speaking to us through its own creation, human consciousness. The powerful archetype of the quest lies behind science's drive to discover the secrets of subatomic matter and the astonishing complexity of the workings of the brain revealed by neuroscience. It is the instigator of the Apollo mission to the moon and the breathtaking exploration of the depths of cosmic space. But, as Einstein said, behind the tireless efforts of an investigator, there lies a stronger, more mysterious drive. It is existence and reality that one wishes to comprehend. A great scientist like Einstein or Hubble may be compared to the visionary or seer who sees beyond the boundaries of the known. He or she will be drawn to make discoveries that will take us out of Plato's cave, where we have spent millennia watching the play of shadows on the walls, instead of seeing clearly the extraordinary nature of the reality in which all our lives are embedded. The discoveries of science have given us a cosmology as radically different from the Copernican and Newtonian ones as they were from the Ptolemaic one. We know that the 16th century discovery that the Earth moved around the Sun had a profound impact on the hierarchical structure of society, as well as promoting a feeling of disorientation. It gave rise to a tremendous sense of freedom as the medieval view of reality ceded ground to a new vision. So it is today, in the surging creativity of our times, that attends the deconstruction of an old paradigm and the birth of a new one. Who would not marvel at the power of the human mind to explore these mysteries, and the inventive genius which has led to the creation of those essential aids of exploration, the telescope and the microscope? Who would not be as excited as the physicists at CERN, who, in July 2012, announced that they had found the holy grail of physics, the elusive Higgs boson or God particle. Scientists claim that this could be the most significant discovery about the universe since Einstein's discovery of relativity in 1905, perhaps one of the most important discoveries of all time. It gives scientists the missing cornerstone of the standard model of the universe and an almost complete picture of the subatomic world. Further research into its nature could lead to further major discoveries and to an understanding of the mystery of dark matter. It may prove that the apparent vacuum of space is an omnipresent field which surrounds the whole universe and permeates every part of it, and it would help to explain how mass is created and even perhaps why it exists. Without the holding power of this field or something like it, these particles would weigh nothing at all and hurtle around at the speed of light. There would be no atoms as we know them, no stars or planets, no human beings like ourselves. Its discovery opens up a vast new field of scientific inquiry. Science and technology have also transformed every aspect of our lives. What was it like to live without electricity, heat, rapid transportation by rail, car, and plane, without telephone, computers, mobiles, and all the aids to domestic life? What was it like to live in fear of fatal diseases like smallpox, leprosy, diphtheria, cholera, and polio, when there was no hope of a cure? Thanks to the revolution in medicine, energy, computer technology, and transport, as well as the fields of research more specifically associated with science, our length of life, our standard of living, and our opportunities for communication with each other have been totally transformed from those that existed a century ago. New technologies such as nuclear fusion, fuel-less cars, and solar energy applied to heating whole cities are being developed, which may eventually diminish our dependence on fossil fuels and counteract the acceleration of global warming. Mobile phones and the internet connect people all over the world to each other. All this has happened and is happening with breathtaking speed, allowing hardly any time to assimilate the effects of this radical transformation of our lives. Reductionist science or scientism. Science, as it is defined today, does, however, present one huge problem. The material world is the only one it recognizes. Reductionist science or scientism rests on the belief that the matter it explores and manipulates is inanimate and dead without consciousness. It has concluded that the universe itself has no inner dimension, no intelligence, no soul. We are the only aspect of life to have the inner dimension of reflective, self-aware consciousness. The scientists who promote this reductionist or materialist belief system reject the idea of God, the soul, and life beyond death. Astrophysicist Bernard Heisch comments in his book, The God Theory, "In a vicious cycle of exclusion, modern science, the champion of objective inquiry, excludes the esoteric as an object susceptible of investigation. In doing so, science has abrogated its responsibility to uncover objective truth and succumb to a dogmatism of its own. To claim that the investigation of the physical world rules out inquiry into anything spiritual is both irrational and dogmatic. To reject evidence simply on the grounds that it cannot yet be measured with instruments in a laboratory is contrary to the scientific spirit of inquiry. It is time to move beyond this fundamentalist science model." A recent book by Rupert Sheldrake called The Science Delusion, 2012, challenges the 10 basic dogmas of science and shows how the sciences are constricted by assumptions originating in the 19th century that have hardened into dogmas and a belief system whose central assumption is that everything is essentially material or physical, even minds. Many scientists are unaware that materialism is an assumption. They simply think of it as science or the scientific view of reality or the scientific worldview. The danger of this situation is that when the one-eyed consciousness of the left hemispheric rational mind is promoted as the only faculty which can define the nature of reality, it possesses, as Jung pointed out, a Promethean freedom, but also partakes of a godless hubris. The birth of a new paradigm. During the years when I was working as a Jungian analyst, I joined an organization called the Scientific and Medical Network. Through this, over some 20 years, I was able to attend conferences where distinguished scientists were invited to speak. I became more and more interested in science, and gradually became aware that we are living in the midst of an astounding scientific revolution. With a sense of growing excitement, I realized that we were moving from the outworn Newtonian view of the universe as a perfectly ordered and precise mechanism to one that recognizes that at the deepest level it is alive, conscious, and the eternally present ground of our own consciousness. For years, I kept this illuminating passage written by the physicist Paul Davies in the Sunday Telegraph magazine in July 1983, because I felt it reflected something of great importance. To study the new physics is to embark on a journey of wonderment and paradox, in which subject and object, mind and matter, force and field become intertwined. We are moving towards an understanding in which matter, force, order, and creation are unified into a single descriptive scheme. To me, the laws of the universe, from quarks to quasars, dovetail together so felicitously that the impression that there is something behind it all is overwhelming. The new paradigm, which is emerging, suggests that we are not the random creation of a mechanical, mindless universe, as scientific reductionism proclaims. We participate in the life of a living and intelligent universe that appears to orchestrate its evolutionary unfolding from within its own cosmic, planetary, and biological processes. We cannot separate ourselves from what we are observing. Again, in the words of Paul Davies, the universe is not a collection of objects, but is an inseparable web of vibrating energy patterns in which no one component has reality independently from the entirety. Included in the entirety is the observer. As I followed the details of this revolution over the last 20 years or so, it seemed as if something as immovable as the Berlin Wall was crumbling, as the long-established reductionist theory of science began to yield to an emerging paradigm which restores the missing metaphysical dimension to the astounding discoveries of science. Referring back to Pitirim Sorokin's theory explored in Chapter 9, I wondered whether a new ideational culture is coming into being as the certainties of the long-established sensate culture weaken. Consciousness as the ground of reality. In a secular culture that has been profoundly influenced by scientific reductionism described above and upheld by the majority of scientists worldwide, there is no awareness, as there was in earlier cultures, of the existence of a dimension of reality which might be compared to the starry night sky, a hidden dimension which can only reveal its presence when the sun's bright radiance is dimmed. Just as it dawned on the early Portuguese explorers that the world was not flat but round, so the realization is dawning that the universe may not consist of dead insentient matter, but is conscious in every part of itself, down to the minute particles within the atom. Einstein said that we cannot solve a problem from the level of consciousness that created it. We have to create the new context in which the solution to a problem can appear. The new context to which the formidable discoveries of science may be aligned is the idea that consciousness, rather than matter, is the ground of reality, and the creative force that has brought the universe into being. Like the prince in the fairy tale of the Sleeping Beauty, this idea is opening a way through the hedge of thorns thrown up by centuries of entrenched beliefs, whether religious or scientific. It has the power to awaken our soul, nurture our imagination, and arouse in us a deeper capacity for relationship with each other and our planetary home. Like the giant UFO in the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind, it seems that an immense invisible field of consciousness is making itself known to us, asking to be recognized by us. The realization that we participate in a dimension of reality that is the source and ground of our own consciousness may eventually shatter the belief that material reality is all there is, that we exist on a randomly created planet in a lifeless, purposeless universe, and that there is no life beyond death. It is perhaps appropriate that this new understanding should emerge from science, since science, far more than religion, has given us the story of how and when our universe, our planet, and our species came into being. It is extraordinary to realize that the new discoveries in science are leading to the recovery of the invisible ground of the cosmos that was known to shamanic culture as well as to Western esoteric traditions of Kabbalah and the contemplative traditions of Vedanta, Buddhism, Taoism, and Sufism. The Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation states that matter is derived from mind, not mind from matter. It is the discovery of the quantum vacuum that is changing our view of reality. It seems that we may be immersed in a sea or field or web of energy that is coextensive with the immensity of the visible universe and the most minute particles of matter. This invisible web connects every one of us to each other and to every aspect of life in the cosmos. Just as we are now discovering that consciousness is distributed through every cell of our body, so we are discovering that it may be present in every photon or particle of light throughout the universe. This discovery tells us that we are literally bathed in a sea of light, invisible to us, yet permeating every cell of our being. This emerging vision is described by Christopher Bache, who, in a striking passage from his book Dark Night, Early Dawn, describes his own experience. I saw humanity climbing out of a valley, and just ahead, on the other side of the mountain peak and beyond our present sight, was a brilliant sun-drenched world that was about to break over us. The time frame was enormous. After millions of years of struggle and ascent, we were poised on the brink of a sunrise that would forever change the conditions of life on this planet. All current structures would quickly become irrelevant. I saw that evolution was indeed no accident, but a creative act of supreme brilliance, and that humanity was being taken across a threshold that would change it forever. Just when Western culture had convinced itself that the entire universe was a machine, that it moves with a machine's precision and a machine's blindness, the ability to experience the inner life of the universe is being given back to us. The entire human endeavor has been emptied of existential purpose and significance because it has been judged to be a product of blind chance. When one gains access to the inner experience of the universe, however, one learns that far from being an accident, our conscious presence here is the result of a supreme and heroic effort. Far from living our lives unnoticed in a distant corner of an insentient universe, we are everywhere surrounded by orders of intelligence beyond reckoning. What Bache's experiences reveal to him is that the entire universe, seen and unseen, is, in his words, a unified organism of extraordinary design, reflecting a massive creative intelligence. All this was once known and has long been forgotten. Despite the firewall set up by reductionist science, it is being recovered now and is leading to the recognition that the cosmos and all that we call nature are ensouled and sustained by the unimaginable intelligence that Bache calls the sacred mind. Just as we have the capacity to imagine, to think, and to feel, an inside play of consciousness and emotions within our physical organism, so the universe has an inside to its visible form, an intelligence, a creative mind, a soul. Matter seems so solid, so obviously organized into distinct separate forms. But what in essence is matter? The physicist Max Planck, 1858 to 1947, who was the first scientist in 1900 to name the quanta of quantum theory, observed, "As a man who has devoted his whole life to the most clear-headed science, to the study of matter, I can tell, as a result of my research about the atoms, this much. There is no matter as such. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force which brings the particles of an atom to vibration and holds the most minute solar system of the atom together. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter." Our view of matter will undergo a transformation as new discoveries are made, but we need to know how the reductionist view came into being, and why science came to reject spirit, and to regard nature as inanimate. Science and the mastery of nature. Until the time of Copernicus, 1473 to 1543, Kepler, 1571 to 1630, and Galileo, 1564 to 1642, science believed it was working in harmony with the laws of the cosmos and had no conflict with religion. The universe was regarded as a sentient organism governed by those laws. Newton still worked within this paradigm. But after the Catholic Church's condemnation of Galileo, science began to draw away from religion. 400 years ago, there was a rupture between science and the metaphysical legacy of the medieval world. The astonishing discovery of Copernicus and Kepler that the Earth orbited the Sun deeply disturbed the establishment and accelerated this rupture. Copernicus's work, De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, was banned by the Catholic Church in 1616 because it was said to be pseudo-scientific. It was only taken off the index in 1820 when the Church accepted that it was proven and deemed to be scientific. In fact, Copernicus did not originate the heliocentric worldview. Aristarchus, known as the Greek Copernicus, envisioned a heliocentric view of the planets, but his view was rejected by Aristotle, the Alexandrian mathematicians, and the astronomer Ptolemy, who favored a geocentric perspective. It was the Ptolemaic model that still prevailed at the time of Copernicus. Kepler, who has never been given the recognition due to him, refined and developed Copernicus's theory. Kepler realized that in order to produce a true heliocentric model in which the Earth is treated just like the other 5 planets known at his time, he would need to calculate the Earth's orbit. He did this by imagining that he was standing on Mars, viewing Earth from there, an act of imagination that Einstein said was true genius. Kepler's seminal scientific works were New Astronomy, 1609, and The Harmony of the World, 1619. His New Astronomy laid down the foundations of modern astronomy, but The Harmony of the World was his magnum opus, integrating geometry, music, poetry, architecture, and astronomy into a glorious synthesis. Galileo did not trouble to read these, but Newton did, describing in his Principia how Kepler's 3 laws of planetary motion could be incorporated in his, Newton's, inverse square law of universal gravitation. As a result of these major discoveries by 4 brilliant men, there was a fundamental shift of focus from religion to science, from faith to knowledge, from confinement within a rigid controlling orthodoxy to release into the passionate exploration of the material world. However, as science drew away from the oppressive control of religion and turned to the observation of nature, it was a nature that increasingly came to be regarded as a soulless mechanism and as something completely separate from both man and the cosmos. The philosopher Joseph Milne, in a profound and illuminating book, Metaphysics and the Cosmic Order, offers a perceptive analysis of how science became an ideology, a belief system, regarding nature as something to be mastered, manipulated, and controlled for the benefit of man. He places the onus for the change in our attitude to nature as something separate and distinct from the cosmic order, on the writings of the philosopher, scientist, and statesman Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626, who declared that the object of knowledge was the control of nature, and that nature in itself had no purpose. It is this new orientation towards nature, Milne observes, that marks the birth of the modern age, not the rise of the sciences as such. And he continues, at a single stroke human nature is alienated from the cosmos. With this alienation, the conception of human knowing shifts from participation in the being of things to the mastery of the will over things. The quest for knowledge moves from the contemplation of reality as an end in itself to subjecting the resources of nature to human mastery and control. It may be that science retained, perhaps unconsciously, some of the basic precepts that had long been held by religion. Foremost among these was the idea derived from the book of Genesis and deeply imprinted on the Christian psyche, that God had given man dominion over the earth and his species. Henceforth, the path that science took did not view nature, other species, and human beings as ensouled and belonging to a sacred order, but increasingly separated matter from spirit, thereby widening the split already long established by religion. Ultimately, it would reject spirit and soul altogether, because it could find no evidence of either in the fields of its exploration. The idea of God was deemed irrelevant, the concept of soul an outgrown superstition. It concluded that the universe had come into being by chance, and that consciousness emerging out of matter was a product of the neurology and biochemistry of the physical brain, a conclusion it has presented as irrefutable fact. Science, like religion, was influenced by solar mythology and the idea of a great battle between light and darkness. It came to see the advance of science in terms of a battle between reason and superstition, and between the rational and the non-rational or irrational. The subliminal influence of this ideology has led science into a position of tremendous hubris in relation to nature and matter, believing that the apparent omnipotence and uniqueness of the human mind gives man the right to master and control nature. It does not view man within the larger context of nature, but sets man above nature. Since the invention of the atomic bomb, science has reached a position of immense power, similar to the power the Church once held. It has become so inflated by its discoveries that it cannot see that its attitude to nature and matter is gravely detrimental to the integrity and well-being of the whole planetary organism. In the terminology of psychology, science can exhibit the same symptoms of grandiosity and omnipotence as the military-industrial system described in the last two chapters. In many television programs on science, we hear the constant theme of how the amazing discoveries of science will lead to a further mastery of nature. In 2008, I happened to hear Professor Brian Cox, one of the most brilliant particle physicists in the United Kingdom, communicating his excitement over the imminent activation of the Large Hadron Collider, CERN, Geneva. Because his words shocked me, I wrote them down. "We are looking for ever more sophisticated ways of torturing matter," he said, echoing the words of Francis Bacon, who said that nature would be bound into service, hounded in her wanderings, put on the rack and tortured for her secrets. If matter is inanimate or dead, then torture can be applied to it, because it has no intrinsic value and no apparent capacity to feel or to be aware of what is done to it. Yet, the choice of the word torture is revealing, suggesting an awareness in the observer that matter is sentient. Why do we have to smash elements of matter together in order to find the Higgs boson particle? Why do we design a laser that can tear apart the fabric of space in order to reveal the secrets of dark matter? The aggressive language used to describe these technological initiatives derives from the deeply held conviction that man's role in relation to nature and matter is to master and control it, if necessary, with violence. It follows naturally from this that science's attitude to nature is reflected in the use of animals in laboratory experiments designed to test drugs for their safety in treating disease in humans. It used to be thought that animals were biological machines that could not feel pain in the way that humans do. Animals have been treated as a kind of subject race. Their suffering, if acknowledged at all, is regarded as necessary to the outcome of the research. The morality of our attitude to animals, mainly primates, dogs, rabbits, and mice, sent in their millions to laboratories, has gone almost unchallenged except by animal rights activists. These animals have no rights which might protect them from our abuse of them. It is apparent that we regard ourselves as a superior species, justified in causing suffering to other species if it serves the purpose of prolonging or enhancing our own lives. However, on July the 7th, 2012, at the Francis Crick Memorial Conference in Cambridge, and in the presence of Stephen Hawking, the scientists present signed the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness in Non-Human Animals, which announced their conclusion that consciousness was present in animals. The absence of a neocortex does not appear to preclude an organism from experiencing affective states. Convergent evidence indicates that non-human animals have the neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological substrates of conscious states, along with the capacity to exhibit intentional behaviors. Consequently, the weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Non-human animals, including all mammals and birds, and many other creatures, including octopuses, also possess these neurological substrates. The distinguished primatologist Jane Goodall believes that the practice of using animals for laboratory experiments is no longer morally and ethically acceptable. To support this, she refers to the research of Andrew Knight and his recent book, The Costs and Benefits of Animal Experiments, in which he concludes that it is clear that animal research is a highly inefficient means of attempting to advance human healthcare, particularly in the light of the very high costs associated with such research in public finances and animal lives. The rational mind and the banishing of soul. The scientific observer has become so detached from what he is observing that he has lost the instinctive awareness that he might be part of a living, intelligent, cosmic, and planetary organism, and that his role should be more in the nature of a servant than a master. Because of the obsessive focus on the way the left hemispheric rational mind perceives reality, empathic feeling, a vital part of our wholeness, has been deliberately and rigidly excluded from scientific methodology. One could say that reductionist science has banished the feminine and the soul, or anima, the carrier of feeling, from its research. Carl Stern's words in his book, The Flight from Woman, are worth recalling. If man's relationship to nature is nothing but that of technological victory, it amounts to a loveless union of man and nature, a rape, and this will end in perdition. In a highly relevant and clarifying passage, Professor Ravi Ravindra, Professor Emeritus at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, comments on science's attitude to nature in his book, Science and the Sacred, Eternal Wisdom in a Changing World. The otherness of nature is an essential presupposition of the scientific attitude, which sees the universe as hostile or at least indifferent, not intentionally but mechanically, to human purposes and aspirations. Therefore, nature needs to be fought and conquered. This view is what allows humans to exploit nature. The more advanced a society is scientifically and technologically, the more pronounced is the exploitation of nature in it. Modern technology is essentially of a piece with modern science in its fundamental procedures and attitudes. Utilizing natural resources for the fulfillment of legitimate human needs has shifted to exploiting nature for gratification of unbridled desires. This shift, clearly in the United States and increasingly elsewhere, is made possible by the increased capabilities of science and technology. It is made easy by the attitude, common to science and technology, of regarding nature as an enemy to be vanquished. He comments further on the devaluation of feeling in our culture. The tragedy is that popular awe of science has led to the devaluation of the function of feeling as a means of arriving at any aspect of the truth, and as a consequence, the quality of feeling in our culture has declined to the level of the infantile or brutal. The mistaken conviction that those limited aspects of reality that are accessible to science constitute the whole has become so deeply ingrained in us that it maintains its tenacious hold even against reason itself, which proposes to us that the most complete view of reality possible for human beings must be that which includes the perceptions of all the faculties, and all the faculties perfected to the highest possible degree. Professor Ravindra's comments reflect the situation described by Ian McGilchrist in his book, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, described in Chapter 9, where the left hemisphere of the brain now exercises too much control over the right. We have been confined without being aware of it within a left hemispheric view of reality, within the limited vision of a one-eyed consciousness. We have mistaken the emissary for the master. Einstein's insight is relevant here. The intuitive mind is a sacred gift. The rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. In his comprehensive overview of the evolution of consciousness described in Cosmos and Psyche, Intimations of a New World View, Richard Tarnas, professor of philosophy at the California Institute for Integral Studies, presents us with a looming question of our time that science does not address. What is the ultimate impact of cosmological disenchantment on a civilization? What does it do to the human self year after year, century after century, to experience existence as a conscious, purposeful being in an unconscious, purposeless universe? What is the price of a collective belief in absolute cosmic indifference? What are the consequences of this unprecedented cosmological context for the human experiment, indeed, for the entire planet? A different approach to the universe is defined in the same book, quoted here and slightly abridged with his permission. Imagine that you are the universe, not the disenchanted, mechanistic, soulless void of conventional modern cosmology, but rather a deep-souled, subtly mysterious cosmos of great spiritual beauty and creative intelligence. Imagine then that you are being approached by two different epistemologies, two suitors, as it were, who seek to know you. To whom would you respond, and to whom reveal your deepest secrets? Would you respond to the one who approached you as if he thought you were essentially lacking in intelligence or purpose, as though you had no interior dimension to speak of, who saw you as fundamentally inferior to himself, who treated you as though your existence were only of value to him if he could develop and exploit your resources to satisfy his own needs, and whose motivation for knowing you was driven by a desire for increased mastery of you? Or would you, the cosmos, open yourself most deeply to that suitor who seeks to know you, not that he might better exploit you, but rather to unite with you, and thereby bring forth something new, a creative synthesis emerging from both of your depths? He seeks to liberate that which has been hidden by the separation between knower and known. His ultimate goal is not increased mastery and control, but rather a more richly responsive and empowered participation in a co-creative unfolding of new realities. His act of knowledge is essentially an act of love and intelligence combined, of wonder as well as discernment, of opening to a process of mutual discovery. To whom would you be more likely to reveal your deepest truths? Tarnas follows his story with an appeal to us to re-enchant the cosmos, to see it with new eyes. He does not ask us to cast aside the methodology of science, the capacity for proving hypotheses by experiment that has been developed with such prodigious effort, but to honor and develop new ways of knowing, which are worthy of the grandeur, depth, and complexity of the cosmos, to integrate the imagination, the moral and spiritual intuition, the revelatory experience and subjective empathic approach that have so far been rigorously excluded from scientific methodology. Above all, he asks us to withdraw our hidden anthropocentric projection of soullessness onto the cosmos, which is the end result of the disassociated ego's will to power over the cosmic and planetary matrix out of which it has evolved. We need to develop ways of knowing which integrate the wisdom of ancient spiritual traditions with the emerging scientific discoveries, which can open our eyes to the existence of the invisible dimensions of the cosmos which surround us and interact with our world. We have to move beyond the limitations of our understanding, which are the end result of the long-standing dissociation within our psyche between the conscious ego and the instinctual soul, whose origins were explored in chapters 5 and 6, and whose effects were summarized in chapter 9. The paradigm shift, consciousness as the ground of reality. What Tarnas asked for is actually taking place. A new cosmology is being born, a new vision of our profound relationship with a conscious, intelligent universe. There is an emerging consensus among certain physicists, astrophysicists, and cosmologists that consciousness and not matter is the primary ground of reality. This is the basic premise of the paradigm shift that is taking place in our time. Instead of seeing the universe as a conglomeration of parts functioning as a kind of gigantic machine, they are seeing it as a unified and living organism, the unseen and seen aspects of it functioning as a unified whole. They are formulating a revolutionary concept of a creative and conscious universe, viewing consciousness as primary and the manifest universe as the creation of cosmic consciousness. Bernard Heisch comments in his book, The God Theory, the challenge for science is going to be to free the tools, experiments, observations, and logic of the scientific method from the shackles of a reductionist materialist ideology, which cannot tolerate the concept of a real consciousness, and especially any consciousness that would be primary over matter. Amit Goswami, professor of physics at Ohio State University, in his book, The Self-Aware Universe, states unequivocally that consciousness is the ground of all being, and quantum physics makes this as clear as daylight. In a later book called The Visionary Window, which builds a bridge between quantum physics and the insights of Vedantic philosophy, he says, positing consciousness as the ground of being calls forth a paradigm shift from a materialist science to a science based on the primacy of consciousness. Such a science leads to a true reconciliation with spiritual traditions, because it does not ask spirituality to be based on science, but asks science to be based on the notion of eternal spirit. Spiritual metaphysics is never in question. Instead, the focus is on cosmology, how the world of phenomena comes about. In this, Goswami was echoing the thoughts of the brilliant physicist Wolfgang Pauli, discoverer of the neutrino. In a lecture he gave in 1955, he stressed the importance of reconciling the rational stance of Western science with the mystical approach of the Eastern traditions in order to achieve a better balance for both the scientist and science. In this, Pauli was undoubtedly influenced by the many conversations he had with Jung, and his realization, after considerable analysis, that he was exhibiting symptoms of imbalance in his life because he was so completely focused on his intellect that he had neglected to connect with his anima. Other physicists and cosmologists are reaching the same conclusion. The universe may not be dead, insentient matter as mainstream science currently holds, but may be conscious and intelligent in ways that are, at present, far beyond our capacity to comprehend. The extraordinary discoveries made over the last 100 years challenge what science has programmed us to believe, that, as a unique species, we are separate from all other species and from our planetary and cosmological environment. Quantum physics shows us that we can no longer separate ourselves as observers from what we are observing. The standard model of the universe says that it started with the Big Bang some 13.7 billion years ago, that it rapidly inflated and then cooled sufficiently to allow the building blocks of matter to form, ultimately bringing into being the billions of galaxies we now know exist. But this is still a hypothesis. We only see 4%, some say 5%, of the known universe. What is concealed in the remaining 96%? Contrary to what was originally thought, there is no such thing as empty space between the 170 billion galaxies of the observable universe. Instead, so-called empty space is full of something called dark matter, comprising 23% of the universe, and dark energy, comprising 73%. The latter is causing the universe continually to expand, while the former acts like a gravitational field, holding the gigantic web of the galaxies in the same relation to each other without allowing the expansion of the space between them. Dark matter emits no light at all, and is therefore totally invisible to scientific instruments. Scientists say they are on the verge of discovering more about it since the discovery of the Higgs boson particle. There are currently 24 types of particle in the known universe. The particles of dark matter, as yet undiscovered, are different from these and pass through solid objects, including our bodies. No one knows how many of these there are, and how many may yet be discovered. In January 2012, astronomers announced that they think dark matter may have helped to form the entire cosmos. During the last 5 years, they have created a detailed map of the distribution of dark matter throughout the universe, and it seems that galaxies and the trillions of stars that comprise them may be held together only by the enormous gravitational pull generated by this mysterious substance. It appears that galaxies may be linked together by a vast cosmic spider's web. This recalls the long-discarded idea of the ether as a foam-like substance that expanded like a flexible mesh or net as the universe expanded. Galaxies that are visible are possibly surrounded by a halo of dark matter, whose concentration is greatest at the center of the galaxy. It is thought that dark matter within the Milky Way is preventing the sun from hurtling out of the galaxy and into deep space. Another newly discovered factor that cosmologists call dark flow makes whole clusters of galaxies move in an inexplicable way. Cosmologists think that this may indicate the existence of another universe beyond ours that is affecting the movement of our galaxies. This suggests to them that our universe may be part of a multiverse, a hypothesis put forward by Lord Rees, the Astronomer Royal, some time ago. When cosmologists discover what dark matter, dark energy, and dark flow are, and how they affect the observable universe, the current standard model may need to be amended in the light of a new theory. As I complete this book, August 2012, a Horizon program on BBC Two mentions that the latest discovery from cosmologists in America is that the universe is apparently infinite. Its circumference cannot be calculated because it is still expanding, and even more incredibly, it may be one of an infinite number of universes. The mind simply cannot assimilate these astounding facts. What is being recovered at a new level of understanding is a development of the cosmology that once existed in shamanic and later Bronze Age cultures and was brought to a remarkable level of description in the voluminous legacy of Plotinus and in the cosmology of Kabbalah and Vedanta. These cosmologies recognize the existence and the interaction of many planes, levels, or dimensions of reality, held within an all-pervasive connecting web of life. We are rediscovering this living web as the ground of our own consciousness. The quantum vacuum. There are 3 vital components which have contributed to the emergence of the new cosmology. The first is the discovery of the quantum vacuum, or quantum plenum, as it is more accurately described. The second is the discovery of the principle of non-locality, and the recognition that all particles of matter are entangled with each other. At the quantum level of reality, we are all connected. The third component is the concept of the universe as a hologram. With the discovery of the quantum field, plenum, underlying our space-time reality, we find the idea returning after a 4,000-year absence of a cosmic womb, out of which all that we call reality and all that we are arises, and to which it may return, similar to the outbreathing and inbreathing of the great cosmic cycles posited long ago by the Vedic sages of India. The quantum field is the source ground of the visible universe, which holds the recorded information of everything that has been, is, and will be in the future. It is like a gigantic memory field holding other fields within it, which eventually manifest as the forms of life on this planet. Quantum theory took off in the 1920s, developing on the foundations laid by a paper published by Max Planck, who, in 1900, formulated the concept of quanta, or bundles of energy, that were later understood to manifest in space-time as both wave and particle. It utterly changed our concept of reality. I will take the description of the quantum vacuum, also called the zero-point field, from the astrophysicist Bernard Heisch, since it is explained in words that a non-scientist can understand. The laws of quantum mechanics posit the sea of the zero-point field as a state of both paradox and possibility. A seething sea of particle pairs, energy fluctuations, and force perturbations popping in and out of existence. It may represent an unlimited source of energy available everywhere, and perhaps even a way to modify gravity and inertia. The quantum vacuum is therefore, in reality, a plenum. The fact that the zero-point field is the lowest energy state makes it unobservable. It acts as a kind of blinding light that precludes our perceiving it through contrast. Since it is everywhere, inside and outside of us, permeating every atom in our bodies, we are effectively blind to its presence. Bernard Heisch suggests that the deep connection between physics and metaphysics lies in the fact that the electromagnetic quantum vacuum is a form of light. It is an underlying sea of energy predicted by the Heisenberg uncertainty principle that permeates every tiny volume of space, from the emptiest intergalactic void to the depths of the Earth, the Sun, or our own bodies. In this sense, our world of matter is like the visible foam atop a very deep ocean of light. The mysterious light of the quantum plenum may be the creative ground of reality, and the ground of everything we are and all that we perceive. Time does not exist in this limitless field of light energy, because by its very nature it is timeless. The information encoded in it is communicated instantaneously in every part of the universe. Through it, every single creature, as well as every single aspect of creation, is indissolubly connected with every other. I can't help making the connection between the light of the quantum plenum and the tradition of Kabbalah, where light is said to emanate from the cosmic womb of being, through all the worlds or dimensions it brings into being, until it creates our familiar world of physical reality. This light, not comparable to the light of the sun, is the unseen ground of the phenomenal world. Kabbalah sees our souls as the sparks of this ineffable ground of light. The all-important Heisenberg uncertainty principle states that the electromagnetic field in the quantum plenum is in a perpetual state of oscillation or fluctuation. These constant vibrations create a sea of light which translates into enormous energy. The light that flows through the matter of the whole manifest universe, including our own physical form, and may, in ways we don't yet understand, bring matter into being and sustain its existence. All possibilities are contained in it, and any possibility can emerge from it. The implications of this are enormous because they mean that we could change our way of thinking, choosing not to follow old dualistic patterns. The distinguished physicist David Bohm, 1917 to 1992, professor of theoretical physics at Birkbeck College, London, was the first scientist to describe the interaction of the quantum field with our visible world. In a book he published in 1980 called Wholeness and the Implicate Order, he defined the primary dimension of reality as the implicate order, the multidimensional, underlying source ground of all life, that he described as a limitless sea of energy and light. What we perceive with our senses as empty cosmic space is actually the plenum, the ground of all existence, including ourselves. He named our three-dimensional world the explicate order, and hypothesized that it was enfolded into the invisible source of the implicate order. He saw the universe, in both its aspects or orders, as a single, undivided whole, and said that matter was nothing other than frozen light. The entire universe of matter, as we generally observe it, is to be treated as a comparatively small pattern of excitation on this invisible sea of light and energy. Bohm's hypothesis of the implicate order takes us back to the shamanic understanding of the underlying presence of the unseen other world, chapter 5. His image of the quantum planum as an ocean or sea of energy recalls the ancient imagery of the Great Mother, Origin of All, chapter 4, and his idea of a unifying cosmic order recalls the unus mundus of the alchemists, chapters 11 and 18. I find it absolutely fascinating that long-discarded ideas are being reanimated in the birth of this new paradigm of reality, formulated in the scientific language of modern cosmologists and physicists. Bohm noted that in early civilizations, man's view of reality was essentially one of wholeness rather than fragmentation, and that this view still survives in the Eastern traditions, particularly that of India. He believes that the fragmentation of our world into different nations, ethnic groups, professions, arts, and scientists, which separates people and things into categories disconnected from each other, has its origin in the kind of thinking, even the subject-object structure of our language, which analyzes and describes things as being inherently separate and distinct from each other, like parts of a machine. Hence, as he observed in the introduction to his book, science itself is demanding a new, non-fragmentary worldview, in the sense that the present approach of analysis of the world into independently existing parts does not work very well in modern physics. It is shown that both in relativity theory and quantum theory, notions implying the undivided wholeness of the universe would provide a much more orderly way of considering the general nature of reality. A centrally relevant change in descriptive order required in the quantum theory is the dropping of the notion of analysis of the world into relatively autonomous parts, separately existent, but in interaction. Rather, the primary emphasis is now on the undivided wholeness in which the observing instrument is not separable from what is observed. He warned of the dangers of our fragmented way of thinking and asked us to examine the actual way we are trained or conditioned to think. What is primarily needed, he said, is a growing realization of the extremely great danger of going on with a fragmentary process of thought. Such a realization would give the inquiry into how thought actually operates, that sense of urgency and energy required to meet the true magnitude of the difficulties with which fragmentation is now confronting us. It is precisely the causes and effects of this fragmentation that Ian McGilchrist addresses in his great contribution, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. It is a pity they never met, for they would have had much to share with each other. It is interesting that Bohm saw the birth of the universe in very different imagery from the standard Big Bang theory, describing it more in the nature of a sudden wave pulse arising out of the fathomless ocean of cosmic energy. This pulse would explode outward and break up into smaller ripples that spread yet further outward to constitute our expanding universe. The latter would have its space enfolded within it as a special, distinguished, explicate, and manifest order. He wrote these moving words for the memorial service of Malcolm Sagan Khan, one of his classmates at university. The same words which summarize his view of reality were read out at his own funeral. In considering the relationship between the finite and the infinite, we are led to observe that the whole field of the finite is inherently limited, in that it has no independent existence. It has the appearance of independent existence, but that appearance is merely the result of an abstraction of our thought. We can see this dependent nature of the finite from the fact that every finite thing is transient. Our ordinary view holds that the field of the finite is all that there is. But if the finite has no true independent existence, it cannot be all that is. We are in this way led to propose that the true round of all being is the infinite, the unlimited, and that the infinite includes and contains the finite. In this view, the finite, in its transient nature, can only be understood as held suspended, as it were, beyond time and space within the infinite. The field of the finite is all that we can see, hear, touch, remember, and describe. This field is basically that which is manifest or tangible. The essential quality of the infinite, by contrast, is its subtlety, its intangibility. This quality is conveyed by the word spirit, whose root meaning is wind or breath. This suggests an invisible but pervasive energy to which the manifest world of the finite responds. This energy or spirit infuses all living beings, and without it any organism must fall apart in its constituent elements. That which is truly alive in the living being is this energy of spirit, and this is never born and never dies. The discovery of non-locality. In 1982, a French physicist called Alain Aspect and his collaborators proved that when an atom emits two quanta of light, called photons, these can, at vast distances from each other, and without exchanging any signals with each other, affect each other instantaneously, at a speed faster than the speed of light. These photons were said to be entangled with each other, and this remarkable discovery gave rise to the theory of non-locality. It was a crucially significant discovery because it pointed to the existence of a field or dimension of reality beyond that of our time and space, which was the medium in which the photons were connecting or communicating with each other. It also suggested that this indicated the essential oneness or inseparability of all aspects of life. This discovery, described colloquially as the butterfly effect, and confirmed by later experiments in 1997, opened up the possibility of reconnecting science with the contemplative traditions of different cultures, which have always recognized the existence of a transcendent level of reality, as well as the existence of many levels or dimensions included or enfolded in that reality. However, because very few scientists are familiar with these traditions, the connection between physics and these ancient cosmologies may not be made. One scientist who has made this connection, Amit Goswami, realized from Alain Aspect's discovery that there is a downward movement of causation from a dimension beyond time and space, as well as an upward movement from matter, and that everything begins with cosmic consciousness. Forces that are beyond or outside the dimensions of space and time can affect elements that are inside them. The result of his reflections was the realization that if consciousness is accepted as the ground of being, the paradoxes that have baffled quantum physicists for decades could be resolved. Just as Aristotle realized so long ago, as described in Chapter 5, we could begin to see that cosmic consciousness, spirit or mind, is profoundly engaged in the whole process that we call evolution. It offers a tremendous panorama of interconnection and evolutionary intention in a cosmic grand design, with ourselves increasingly participating in this unfolding design as our own understanding develops and as we make new discoveries. Goswami's book, The Self-Aware Universe, How Consciousness Creates the Material World, 1993, and his later books grew out of these insights. In their recent book, Cosmos, A Co-Creator's Guide to the Whole World, cosmologist Dr. Jude Currivan and systems analyst Dr. Irvin Laszlo summarize how our understanding has been changed by these extraordinary discoveries. During the last 30 years, such phenomena as telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, the power of meditation and prayer, and the ability by thought alone to affect the outcome of apparently random events have come under increasing scientific scrutiny. The hundreds of thousands of experiments throughout this time have accumulated a huge database showing that the evidence for non-local awareness and influence is now overwhelming. A holographic universe. David Bohm was the first scientist to recognize that the universe was designed on the principle of a hologram, and this idea is now being revisited and developed by other scientists, Jude Caravan and Irvin Laszlo explore the emerging vision of an informed cosmos that is wholly integrated and coherent, where despite the communication between apparently separate events within space-time being limited by the speed of light, the deeper reality is enduring and quasi-instantly interconnected. They describe the new understanding that is changing our view of reality and manifesting in all fields of scientific endeavor. The understanding that the universe is designed as a holographic template, and there is a field of cosmic intelligence beyond our time and space that underlies, permeates, and gives rise not only to physical reality, but to all that we may discover to be reality. The latest discoveries across all scientific disciplines are revealing a radical new vision of the nature of the physical world as being imbued with and informed by a holographic field. Thus, it is innately interrelated, coherent and harmonic at all scales of existence. Caravan and Laszlo continue. It appears that all that we term physical reality is ultimately harmonically and holographically ordered. We cannot exclude ourselves from the holographic and coherent nature of the universe. Even when we believe we're making choices that are independent of others, we still find that those choices become part of collective patterns that are part of the coherent whole world. As the ancient sages would say, we are the many expressed by the one, and we are the one that is expressed by the many. We are creation, and we are co-creators. It seems as if, through the infinitesimal spark of cosmic light that is our human consciousness, the universe is revealing itself to our astounded gaze, and what it is revealing is that the creation of the universe could not have been a random happening. As they comment, the exquisite harmony of these cosmic relationships includes the fundamental ratios between the electrical and nuclear forces that bind atoms and molecules, and the vastly weaker force of gravity. Their precisely balanced energies and the exact yet varied nature of their interrelationships, from the moment our universe was born, have enabled the formation and interaction of chemical elements, the birth of stars, galaxies, and planets, and the evolution of biological organisms and ecologies. Without their incredible level of finely tuned precision from the very beginning of space-time, the complex universe we experience could not exist. Even more mind-blowing is the hypothesis that the physical universe's continued expansion carries with it an inbuilt template of information that apparently existed from its very beginning, or possibly even before its beginning, prior to the existence of the quantum plenum. This cosmic informational template holds within it the design of the process of expansion and development of the universe as a coherent, unified entity. Yet it also facilitates the emergence of all kinds of possibilities as it expands. Morphic fields. Rupert Sheldrake's hypothesis of morphic fields belongs to what is being discovered about the universe as a holographic field of information, holding within itself the potential unfolding of a stupendous evolutionary design. As he describes them, morphic fields are multiple fields of information, nested within each other, which create and sustain the biological patterns which give plants, animals, and humans their form, and their instinctive behavior patterns, sustaining these through thousands, even millions of years, yet adding to them as new skills are learned. These skills then become available through morphic resonance to all members of their particular species. As Sheldrake explains in his latest book, The Science Delusion, my own hypothesis is that the formation of habits depends on a process called morphic resonance. Similar patterns of activity resonate across time and space with subsequent patterns. This hypothesis applies to all self-organizing systems. All draw upon a collective memory and in turn contribute to it. Self-organizing systems, including molecules, cells, tissues, organs, organisms, societies, and minds, are made up of nested hierarchies or holarchies of holons or morphic units. At each level, the whole is more than the sum of the parts, and these parts themselves are wholes made up of parts. The wholeness of each level depends on an organizing field called a morphic field. This field is within and around the system it organizes, and is a vibratory pattern of activity that interacts with electromagnetic and quantum fields of the system. Through morphic resonance, humans, animals, and plants are connected with their predecessors. Each individual both draws upon and contributes to the collective memory of the species. Animals and plants inherit the habits of their species and of their breed. The same applies to humans. An extended understanding of heredity changes the way we think of ourselves, the influence of our predecessors, and our effects on generations yet unborn. Like the evolutionary biologist Elizabeth Sartoris in her book Earth Dance, Sheldrake does not see life as a ruthless battle for survival as suggested by Richard Dawkins in his book The Selfish Gene, but rather as a cooperative enterprise unfolding over billions of years with ever-increasing complexity. Evolution, he says, may be the result of an interplay between habits and creativity. New forms and patterns of organization appear spontaneously and are subject to natural selection. Those that survive are likely to appear again as new habits build up, and through repetition they become increasingly habitual. Sheldrake's theory of morphic fields resonates with Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, as well as with the Indian concept of the Akashic records, the vast memory fields which carry the imprint of all past planetary and human experience. Sheldrake believes his theory of morphic resonance might work either through the transfer of information from the implicate to the explicate orders posited by David Bohm, or else through the quantum vacuum field, the mediator of all quantum and electromagnetic processes. He says that his hypothesis is eminently testable, and evidence from many fields of inquiry already supports it. The harmonic patterns of the cosmos. Pythagoras, who spent long years of study with the Egyptian and the Babylonian astronomers, formulated the principles of sacred geometry, which he believed reflected the innate harmonic order underlying the visible forms of the cosmos, and knew that mathematics was the key to understanding this harmonic order. With the advent of computer technology, we are now beginning to discover the inherent harmony of the basic geometric patterns that underlie the complex systems of the universe. Following Benoit Mandelbrot's discovery in 1975 of the exquisite patterns that he named fractals, which were found to replicate themselves from the smallest to the largest scale, these are being recognized as the basic patterns, the fundamental structures, whether in cabbages, coastlines, or galaxies, even social systems and financial dynamics, that underlie the appearance of the entire manifest world. They reveal a profoundly harmonic, ordered, and unified universe, hidden beneath the apparent chaos and differentiation of multiple complex systems. In a holographic quantum universe, everything is connected to everything else, in what is virtually a stupendous intelligent field of information and a unifying web of life. This returning concept of wholeness or unity is, at a new level of the spiral of evolution, a rediscovery of the shamanic lunar participatory awareness of the unified nature of all cosmic and planetary life. It facilitates a union of two kinds of consciousness that have for so long been separated in us, the consciousness of the rational mind and that of the instinctual soul, the masculine and feminine aspects of our being. It invites us to become more aware of connections, to move beyond concepts of cause and effect and external causation into a universe of relationships, interdependence, and essential unity in the seething creative energy in which all our lives are embedded. Because at the quantum level we are connected to each other, when thousands of us begin to change our understanding of reality, millions are affected. The more conscious and connected we become, the more we can generate inspiration and ideas flowing to us from this deep ground of the cosmos. Humanity and cosmos become a co-creating partnership. This may still be far removed from the position of most scientists, yet the fact that even a few individual scientists are reflecting upon this idea goes far towards bringing together metaphysics and physics in a radically new cosmology, unifying life, consciousness, and cosmos. The dangers of science. Returning to the world of our everyday experience, science has brought us extraordinary discoveries as well as many material benefits, and, for a small proportion of the whole of humanity, higher standards of living. Yet, science, when it falls into the hubristic stance of seeing itself standing above nature, has, as suggested in Chapter 12, the tendency to slip into the language of an ideology rather than the methodology it claims to be. Certain scientists claim that thanks to the current information revolution and the development of nanotechnology, we will soon be able to program matter to order, changing the actual structural patterns of matter and creating synthetic genes that fulfill our every whim, giving us mastery of life and of matter. In its positive aspect, this new technology could be applied to creating minute machines which deliver drugs to different parts of the body, or creating organs to replace damaged or failing organs, so prolonging our lives. But it could equally be used to develop new weapon systems which could infiltrate those of other nations and destroy them, or enable them to destroy us. We learn that nanoparticles have been inserted into tennis rackets and that they could be used to cure certain diseases like cancer. Food manufacturers are considering inserting them in foods. But will we be told in advance that strawberries, for example, will contain nanoparticles to enhance their color and taste or prolong their shelf life? And will the scientists who develop this technology be fully informed of the effects it might have on the immune system of the body, possibly affecting the lives of our children and grandchildren? This new science could bring us the possibility of untold benefits, but also an even greater capacity to interfere with or subvert the basic structures and processes of life. Commenting on the new science of nanotechnology, Lord Rees, in the epilogue of his book, Our Final Century, questions whether we are morally capable of discriminating between the undoubted benefits and the unforeseen risks that might be engendered by our technology. The obverse of technology's immense prospects is an escalating variety of potential disasters, not just from malevolent intent, but from innocent inadvertence as well. The benefits opened up by biotechnology are manifest, but they must be balanced against the accompanying hazards and ethical constraints. Robotics or nanotechnology will also involve trade-offs. They could have disastrous or even uncontrollable consequences when misapplied. The public learn about these scientific advances after they have taken place. We didn't know much about the genetic engineering of plants and seeds until we heard of Monsanto's attempts to prevent farmers in India from using the seeds generated by their own crops, replacing them with Terminator seeds that could not regenerate. Hundreds of thousands of farmers have committed suicide as a result of this because they could not afford the cost of buying new seeds every year, and because the seeds they were forced to purchase often failed to produce crops. Vandana Shiva, director of the International College for Sustainable Living in Dehradun in India, has repeatedly drawn attention to the suffering inflicted on Indian farmers as a result of this shocking practice, and has challenged the encroaching power of Monsanto. She has also started a worldwide movement to ensure that seeds cannot be patented by these giant corporations, 5 of which already control 75% of the world's commercial seed supply. She has inspired many movements which are now emerging to prevent the multinational corporations gaining greater control of the world's food supply, to prevent the commercialization of genetically engineered crops for animal and human consumption, and to preserve the right of people to protect biodiversity and oppose the patenting of any life forms. These are the heritage of all humanity, and should not be appropriated for commercial use by any corporation, however powerful. In the field of nuclear science, we have now discovered that thorium, instead of the far more dangerous uranium, could have been the fuel used in nuclear reactors, and that a design for a thorium reactor existed after the Second World War, but, under pressure from the military, was rejected by the US government in favor of a uranium one. Uranium was chosen because plutonium, its residual byproduct, could be used in nuclear weapons. Only since the Fukushima disaster has this fact emerged into the public domain. There seems to be no forum in which people could participate in a debate on whether these advances should take place, or these decisions be taken. Too much hangs on the dubious moral maturity of the scientific experts, corporate bodies and governments who take these decisions on behalf of a nation or even humanity as a whole. The public, that amorphous mass of voiceless and choiceless individuals who are manipulated by the spin of governments and scientific experts, has no effective say in hugely important decisions which affect the lives of every one of us, as well as those of future generations. It is in the domain of technology that the amoral ethos which drives science is most clearly revealed. Why should there be a need for ethical concerns when humanity is so obviously the beneficiary of technological advance? And who better to preside over that advance than scientific experts? Professor Ravindra's comment is cautionary. The metaphysics of modern science has built right into it the axiom that the state of being of the scientists is irrelevant to the science they produce. Whether one is good or bad, fearful, hateful, or kind is beside the point in determining one's qualities as a scientist. We should keep in mind that a majority of all scientists and technologists in the world actually work for the military or for the war machine in one form or another. The assumption that the level of a person's consciousness or moral preparation is irrelevant to the quality of science that the person does is built into the procedures of science. Bill Joy, some years ago co-founder and chief scientist of Sun Microsystems, and formerly co-chair of the Presidential Commission on the Future of IT Research, asks us to become more alert to the dangers of the direction in which we are moving. We have, he says, become used to scientific breakthroughs, but have not recognized that the three new technologies of robotics, genetic engineering, and nanotechnology are different from the ones that preceded them, in that all three have the capacity to amplify through self-replication. Self-replication in these new technologies runs a much greater risk of substantial damage in the physical world, even the destruction of the biosphere on which all life depends. A bomb is blown up only once, but one altered gene can become many and quickly get out of control. In his article, Bill Joy quotes Eric Drexler, who explained in his book, Engines of Creation, plants with leaves, no more efficient than today's solar cells, could outcompete real plants, crowding the biosphere with an inedible foliage. Tough, omnivorous bacteria could outcompete real bacteria. They could spread like pollen in the wind, replicating swiftly and reducing the biosphere to dust in a matter of days. Dangerous replicators could easily be rapidly spreading, too tough and small to stop. We have trouble enough controlling viruses and fruit flies. We cannot afford these kinds of accidents with self-replicating assemblers. These new technologies do not require large facilities and rare materials like uranium, as is the case with nuclear weapons. It will suffice for a few people to have knowledge of them, for them to be able to apply it to whatever ends they envisage, including the creation of new weapons of mass destruction. In a few decades, we will be able to build computers much more powerful than the ones we use today. And this computing power could be fused with the advances in the physical sciences and radical developments in the field of genetics. We would then have access to unimaginable power to transform our environment and ourselves, redesigning the world according to our view of what it could and should be in terms of what brings our own species the greatest advantage through directing and, if necessary, changing nature's processes. But whose utopian vision would this be? And who would hold the whole of humanity and possibly millions of other species hostage to it? Bill Joy concludes, if we could agree as a species what we wanted, where we were headed and why, then we could make our future much less dangerous. Then we might understand what we could and should relinquish. If the course of humanity could be determined by our collective values, ethics, and morals, and if we had gained more collective wisdom over the past few thousand years, then a dialogue to this end would be practical, and the incredible powers that we are about to unleash would not be nearly so troubling. An ethical direction for science. To define an ethical direction for science, we need to recover the missing values grounded in the metaphysical insights of the great spiritual traditions, which stress our essential unity and our responsibility to care for each other. Integral to these values is the need to protect the interconnected systems or organisms of planetary life. In a secular society, there is no consensus as to what fundamental ethical values should guide us. The lure of financial profit drives many scientific endeavors, particularly those involving the application of new drugs, but also new weapons and new technologies such as robotics and nanotechnology.
In his book, Ancient Wisdom, Modern World, Ethics for a New Millennium, published in 1999, His Holiness the Dalai Lama asks us to become aware of the motivation that influences what we do. He urges us to take as our ethical guide our latent capacity for empathy and compassion for others, the desire to increase and enhance their happiness and decrease their suffering. By imagining what might add to the happiness and decrease the suffering of all beings, not just those belonging to our national or ethnic group, we can develop this ethical capacity. His suggestion recalls the words of the message quoted in Chapter 1. Every act of a human being must be judged against the question, does it offend nature? Does it offend God? Does it injure life? To adopt these values as an ethical guide, science would have to alter its current assumption that the universe it observes is without consciousness. If the whole universe is assumed to be made up of dead matter in purposeless motion, no more than an agglomeration of parts and functions, then it is difficult to regard it as a sacred order or entity with its own inbuilt intelligence and evolutionary intention, and it is very difficult to adopt an ethical attitude towards it, giving consideration to what might be helpful or harmful to it. If the cosmos is assumed to be without consciousness, meaning, or purpose, then we, as the only conscious elements in a dead universe, are deprived of any deep meaning to our lives, or any sense of responsibility other than that related to our own needs. We will continue to exploit the resources of the planet for the benefit of our species alone, until such time as we wake up from our dream of power over nature and call a halt to our amoral and unconscious behavior. Trish Pfeiffer, co-editor with the late Professor John Mack of Mind Before Matter, Visions of a New Science of Consciousness, sums up the essence of a different approach to reality in the prologue to their book. What would a world be like based on a mindset that understood that all is one and interconnected? How soon could the knowledge that we live in a participatory world initiate change in our thinking about war and our desecration of the planet? Would a world aware of the primacy of consciousness be akin to the world as seen by some of the indigenous peoples? Would we then see the cosmos as a living presence and the whole universe and all of nature as intelligent? Would we discover that the physical laws of the universe were habits, evolving rather than immutable? Would we begin to sense other realities and other dimensions? When we realize that time and space are not fundamental dimensions underlying reality, would it change forever our ideas about death? Would we strive for unconditional love? How would human relationships, social justice, poverty, science, medicine, politics, the government, and the military be reframed according to consciousness primary perspectives.